Hello, welcome to Cozy Costume Creations. Today I'm going to teach you guys how to make an apron from scratch. So let's get started. This is what it's going to look like when it's done. Hello, I'm Sarah Beth, and today I'm going to teach you guys how to make an apron. Right now I work at Ohio University and I teach the Masters of Fine Arts programs in Costume Technology and Costume Crafts and the undergraduate programs for both of those. I have been working in theater and opera and dance for 11 years now, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I got my Bachelor of Arts degree from Brigham Young University in Theater Arts Studies, and that's where I learned all of this. So that's why you should listen to me. So yeah, I'm going to teach you guys how to make an apron today. Next week, I'm going to teach you how to make a cartridge pleated skirt, which is what this is. That's a little bit higher level skill than this. This is kind of going to be about your easiest introduction. So if you're a beginner, I think this is a really great place to start. So let's get started. For this, you're going to need a measuring tape. I recommend these bendy rulers. They're really great. You'll probably also want a variform ruler. That's what this is, because we're going to make the pattern for the apron as well. So we're doing this entirely from scratch, right? You'll also want some push pins. Got some push pins. You want fabric scissors, of course, because you're going to cut some fabric. Surprise, surprise. You'll want paper scissors because you're making a pattern. You want separate scissors to cut your paper with. Misconception. Some of my students, I had a student once who was like, and this has happened multiple times, where they use their fabric scissors to cut paper, which is like rule number one, absolutely do not do. And they're like, oh, it works just fine. Yes, it works fine. The point of not using your fabric scissors on other things is you don't want to dull your fabric scissors on other objects. So that's the reason that you don't use fabric scissors on paper, because you can dull up your paper scissors and do whatever. But you're really going to want sharp scissors for cutting fabric so you can get nice, precise, beautiful things. You don't have any divots that the fibers are going to catch on and pull. Like, you want really nice, sharp scissors, so that's why you preserve them, right? That's why we do that. You'll also want snip scissors. This is the type of scissors you use for thread cutting. And then you want some quilting pins, is my preferred type of pin. I think these are the 2-inch. Lemon heads. So those are great. I also have a magnetic pin holder. If you don't have one of those, that's fine. You will, of course, need a sewing machine for this, so please have one of those. I'm going to show you how to do this also using a serger. You don't have to have a serger. As a replacement for serging, you can also do just a zigzag stitch. And if you want to skip serging, you can. I don't recommend it. I think you should do some kind of way to finish it off. And that goes back to my theater background, where we serge everything, and we'll talk about why we do that later. You will also need an iron, because rule number 1 is that half of sewing is ironing. So have an iron. It'll make your life so much better. You'll especially want one that can do some steam, is preferable. You will also need a water-soluble pencil. I recommend the Clover brand, as well as a pencil sharpener. You will also need some interfacing, and I would recommend the fusible interfacing. You can use lightweight or medium. But yeah, so those are the things that you're going to need, as well as some fabric. Surprise, surprise. You can't sew a thing if you don't have any fabric. So this is a fabric actually that I designed. So this is mine. So I like it. I think it's really cute, and I'm really excited to use it to make a cute little apron. So this is mine. If you like the pattern, you can check it out. I'll put the link below. It's on Spoonflower, so you can buy it if you want to, but also whatever fabric you use is totally fine. It's great. I'm just using mine because I love it and I made it. So there we go. The first thing I'm going to do after buying a fabric, do you see how this is fraying? This is why we love sergers, and this is why we love them in theater, is because we buy new fabrics all the flipping time, and the first thing you have to do with a new fabric is wash it. Wash, 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 wash. Why should we wash our fabric? There are about 5 or 6 reasons. Number one, you don't know where this came from or what the factory settings that it was made in are like. So whatever is on there, you just want to wash it off just because. You also want to wash it off because this is so crisp. This looks beautiful, right? Like, look at that. It is gorgeous. It is lovely. It is crisp. It is lying flat. And I know that this is 100% cotton, and that's not how cotton acts. Cotton is a very wrinkly fabric, right? Cotton wrinkles. When I do that, I'm not getting a wrinkle. The reason is because the manufacturer has put some finishes on this to make it look nice and flat and straight and beautiful. So it looks really good for sale, right? And when it arrives, it looks really nice. However, we're going to have to remove all of those finishes because that's not really what this fabric is or what it's going to act like. This is especially important if you're dyeing something, and I'll do some dyeing demos later. But yeah, you got to remove the finishings on the fabric because those are unnatural. You also want to shrink the fabric. So this is called pre-shrinking. Again, I know that this fabric is 100% cotton, and that's what I recommend for this project. I think you should use 100% cotton. There are a few reasons for that. One is because polyester is not a great fabric to have in your kitchen because it melts. Polyester is a synthetic fiber, and it's everywhere, and it's great, and I love it. It's got a lot of really great uses. However, it's not great for something like a kitchen because polyester can melt, and that can be dangerous for you as the wearer if you're wearing something that could melt and hurt your skin versus cotton, which will just burn. So the burning is actually going to probably hurt you less than melting, and that's hopefully never going to happen. But anyway, I recommend cotton, so use cotton. Okay, so cotton shrinks though. That's one thing we know about cotton, right? Polyester doesn't. It's a synthetic fiber. It doesn't have the same properties. It doesn't shrink. So fiber content matters. That's what it is. It's the fibers that this is made up of. So this is from cotton, which comes from the cotton plant. And that's the whole thing. But it shrinks. So we want to pre-shrink this. We want to shrink this before we do anything, right? Because if I make this into something that fits me perfectly, and then I go and throw it in the wash, and it shrinks, now when it comes out, it's not going to fit me anymore. So I want to shrink it beforehand so that any shrinkage is happening right here, right now, not after the garment has been made and already fits perfectly. That might not matter as much for an apron, but for something like a fitted garment, it's going to matter a whole heckin' lot. And it might not even fit the actor or actress after that's happened, right? So that's why you always pre-shrink your fabrics because you don't want it to shrink later on. You want to get the shrinkage done now, right? So we're going to take it, we're going to wash it on the highest heat setting that the fiber can take. So whatever fiber this is, the highest amount of heat it can take, I want to do that because the high heat is what's going to shrink it, right? High heat also is disinfectant and can help wash and clean a lot of these things off. So the highest heat that most cotton fibers can take, it's really cotton fibers, but it depends on like how it's been treated with some dyes or some other things might change this a little bit. So, you know, there's that. But this is a print. So it's just been printed on one side and the color doesn't go through to the other side. It's not true blue, right? It's just on one side. So this is just a print. I don't have to worry about any of that weird stuff. I can wash this on a high heat setting. That's kind of the hottest that cotton can go. Some other fibers you might want to use some gentler, like a warm. Some of them you don't want to go past a cold. But for cotton, you can wash hot, and you want to shrink it, right? So we're going to wash it on high heat, and we're also going to dry it. It doesn't have to be on high heat. A medium heat's pretty good, but my dryer doesn't have a medium heat setting, which is kind of silly, but whatever. So we're going to wash it first. Now, I have all of this fraying happening, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to serge these edges so that I don't have just like a mess of threads unraveling in the washer, right? That I've got an agitator in my washer, and this is going to go around and around and be swooshing in the water. So if I don't finish this edge nicely in some sort of way, I'm going to have just like a mess of tangled threads and crap when I come out, right? when I pull this out of the washer. And that's not a great time. Sometimes it gets like stuck around the agitator. You gotta like cut it out. It's not great. And it also just uses up more of your fabric. So you're losing fabric when you do that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use a serger. Again, it's okay if you don't have a serger. You could use like a zigzag stitch or some other kind of binding stitch on your machine. But I'm gonna do serger. So I'll show you how to do that. Also, well, just real fast. So this is the type of apron that we're going to make. Just a very simple apron where it's got these two pockets. You don't have to do pockets. You can also change what the pockets are. You could do like a little center pocket or some wider pockets. You could do anything you want with the pocket because I'll teach you how to draft the pocket that you want. We've just got these two straps and we've got a neck strap. So it's really simple. It's one main piece with like two long rectangles, well, three long rectangles. This is the same one though. And then two little squares. It's really easy, really simple. I think it's pretty cute. This is one I have made before many years. So it's got the authentic flour stain from being used to make cinnamon rolls and stuff. And I think it's really cute, really flattering, kind of nice. So let's make it. All right, this is my beautiful Juki serger. I love it. It's so great. A serger is a type of sewing machine that binds things off so it does a finishing on it. So it gives you a nice, beautiful finished edge. It also has a blade right here, and that is for cutting. So I have all of these gross threads hanging off, and this will chop those threads off, which is really great. So it chops them off as it goes through and kind of finishes that edge. So it chops it and then binds it off. So it gives you a really clean, beautiful finished edge, and I love it. So great. So let me show you how to use it. I'm gonna lift the presser foot. This is different from most machines because you let it run out after you've sewn. So that's why I've got this chain kind of coming off of it, right? Because I want to leave a chain at the beginning and end, otherwise it comes unthreaded. This has 4 threads on it. This is a 4-thread serger. You can have 3-thread sergers, 4-thread sergers, and 5-thread sergers. You usually do more than that. I think it's probably possible, but those are the ones I usually work with. And this is a domestic serger. You can also have industrials, which are a lot faster. And you'll see them in a lot of shops. All right, so I've lifted the presser foot. I'm gonna put this guy right under here. Whoop. And then I try to usually align this edge just with the very edge of the thing here. And that just helps you guide it in, control what's getting chopped off. So you can see, especially with all these gross threads, they're going to get chopped off. It's going to be lovely. You see how I let it run out? You want to do that, right? You see how the blade is going up and down too, so it can chop off those threads? That's why sergers can be a little bit scary, and you want to keep your fingers clear of them. So be careful when you use this kind of machine because it does have a blade and it could hurt you. So now what I have is this beautiful finished edge, right? There's no gross fraying happening. It's just beautiful. It's bound off, and all of my gross things have been chopped off. So it's beautiful. It's finished. Love it. All right, so my fabric is all nice and serged. You only need to serge the edges that are fraying. You don't need to serge the selvage edge because that is a finished edge. I know it looks like it's fraying, it's not. So this edge is totally finished, and so is this edge, right? This is called the selvage edge. It's also the warp. We'll talk about why that's really important later, but it's very important. So I just need to serge my top and bottom where it was cut, right? I don't need to do these other edges, right? Just those two. And on this stripe, it's really easy to tell which way it is because my stripe goes the direction of the selvage edge, and the weft edge is perpendicular to that, right? All right, so I've got my washing machine, and I'm going to turn this all the way up to hot because that's the hottest heat setting that cotton can take. And casual sounds good to me, that's fine. So I'm going to open this up and we put in our detergent first. All right, so this is Free and Clear. This is a detergent that we use a lot in theater as well. I use it at home. I'm doing this from home, so I'm not using all of the shop things and stuff to teach you. I'm doing this for funsies and with my summer, I guess. But I also use the Free and Clear. The reason we use this in theater a lot is because lots of people have allergies and sensitivities, right? So you want to mitigate that as much as possible. You don't want the costume to cause irritation to the actor or actress, right? So we use Free and Clear because it's free of perfumes and dyes, and it's much more sensitive and much better for sensitive skin, and just nicer for the skin. That's also why it's #1 brand recommended by dermatologists, allergists, and pediatricians for sensitive skin. I have sensitive skin and eczema, and so that's why I use it. But it's also just really great. It's what we use in our shop. So Free and Clear would recommend so that you're not using anything that's going to irritate the actors, especially when like one actress might be allergic to wool, and this actress is allergic to this specific dye, and this actress is allergic to all perfumes and fragrances. So you just want to just do what you can to clear that all up and just make it as easy as possible. Just one Free and Clear for everybody, so we don't have to, sort everything by all of the allergies. All right, so I'm going to put some of this in. And then we'll throw our beautiful fabric in. Get it going. All right, you can see that I don't have a medium heat setting, which would probably be better for the fabric. But I only have high heat and low heat and no heat. Kind of silly, but whatever. So I'm going to do a timed high heat for about 50 or 45 minutes. It's pretty good. And that'll help shrink my fabric because not only the heat from the washer, but also the heat from the dryer is what helps those fibers shrink so that they won't shrink in the future after I've made it exactly how I want it to be. Right? All right, this is something I want to note super fast. It's not relevant for this, but it might be relevant future because when you're dyeing fabrics, when a fabric is wet, it's always darker than it's going to actually be. So if I'm looking at it while I'm dyeing it and it looks like exactly the color I want it to be, I'm going to want to let it sit longer or maybe add more dye so they can be that color, because when it dries, this is not going to be this color. So just remember that your fabric is going to be darker when it's wet than when it is dry. I noticed that nothing was tangled up on itself because we searched those edges, right? All right, let's pull our fabric out of the dryer. You can hear it and you can see it, that the fabric is totally different now that the finishings have been removed, right? You can see how it's just, the texture is totally different. It's kind of wrinkly. And this is how cotton should be. This is how it is naturally, right? I don't know if you can see super well, but it's just a little bit more textured, a little bit softer, and a little bit more wrinkly. So that's why they want it to look really nice in the showroom, but naturally, cotton really, really wrinkles. You can see that. It's just got some more texture to it now. So this is a little bit more natural. This is normal. And this is part of the reason that we wash it first, is to kind of get it back to its kind of normal, natural state that it's actually going to be in after we wash it and dry it and use it all of the time, right? So we're going to take this And even though this is, how it's going to be, we don't want to leave it like this when we sew it, because if I just go ahead and lay out my pattern on the fabric as it is, this is wrinkly, you know? So I'm not going to get as straight and beautiful cuts. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to iron this. But Sarah Beth, we just had it all nice and pretty and now it's all wrinkly and stuff now. Why didn't we just cut it before? Good question. Remember, we have to shrink it, so it's not going to be shrunk after we sew it, right? So we pre-shrunk it. And we do want to just remove all of those finishings on top. And now when we iron it, it's already pre-shrunk. It's already got that heat. It's already done that, right? We don't have to worry about shrinking in the future. Is the big main reason, right? So I'm going to use my iron, and I have it set to the cotton setting because there are different heat settings. Cotton is the highest heat setting. So like we washed it on the high heat, you can also use the high heat for the iron. So this just shows, once again, high heat is totally safe and good for this. High heat is what's going to make all of these wrinkles go away because, yeah, you can see it's pretty wrinkly right now, right? You also want steam. And the steam is going to help this not be wrinkly, right? And I'm getting some calcium deposits, so that means it's probably time for me to clean out my iron because the calcium is depositing, and then it's just going to come out. All right, so let's go ahead and iron this. This is why you should use distilled water in your iron, because then you don't get calcium deposits. That's the most ideal, but I also, when I'm home sewing, I don't want to spend the money on that. We do have a distiller in our costume shop at the OU shop, and that's really nice, and so we use that for our irons. You see how much crisper and nicer this is than the section that hasn't been ironed yet, right? You can see that. And this is also just what takes up your craftsmanship a level of, if I were to cut this and use this all wrinkly and stuff, it's just not going to be nice and sleek and as precise as after it's ironed, right? Look at that being ironed. It's beautiful. It's nice. And that's the great thing about cotton, is it irons really well. It really responds to that heat. All right, here's a quick object lesson of why we want to iron our fabric before we do anything else. So this is a piece of muslin, which is also 100% cotton. And you can see it's washed, so it's pretty wrinkly and not so amazing, right? So I'm going to wrinkle it up even a little bit more because cotton really takes wrinkles. Look at that. It kept all that. Yuck. Gross, gross, gross. So if I then take this piece and I'm going to be like, yep, I'm just going to cut this out of these pieces. It's just not going to be as precise when I cut this out, right? Because I've got these wrinkles getting in the way. Pretend maybe I've got some horrid wrinkle like this that's kind of more textured, right? I'm not going to get as precise of a thing because these wrinkles, they take up space, right? They're not zero space. So this one is taking up a lot of space. Look at that guy, right? So if I try to cut on a place where that's going on, that space is gonna, it's gonna make this bigger, right? Because that wrinkle is taking up space. So it's going to make this pattern piece bigger. Or if I'm doing an edge or a corner, it might warp the edges a little bit, right? It's just not going to be as precise or beautiful. Versus if I iron it, look how I now have this beautiful, crisp, clean thing that I can just stick this straight on top and have something really precise and exact, right? We really want to focus on exactness, precision, being meticulous, and being great craftspeople, right? So yeah, you gotta iron stuff. Alright, so while the fabric is getting washed, we're going to make the pattern. So this is one that I made when I was working in Texas. This was actually for when I designed Elf the first time. So this is my pattern. And I'll just show you kind of what it looks like on. And then we'll talk through how we got here. Alright? In theater, we make our patterns so they don't have seam allowance. So our patterns don't have seam allowance on them. What's seam allowance? Good question. It's something that you add so that your fabrics don't just touch, right? So when I'm sewing a fabric and I have to sew this to another thing, right? I can't just touch those fabrics to each other. I can't just sew it that way where they're just touching, right? I have to have something that overlaps, and then I can stitch it, and then that overlapping is what kind of holds it in place. That might be a bit confusing, but basically you can't just magically stick two fabrics together and have them just like stick together, right? You have to sew, which means you have to have some added space in between in those seams, right? If you flip any of your seams, you can look and see that there's like some bulk that doesn't just end there, right? There's something in that seam that is the seam, and that's the seam allowance, right? There's some extra. That might be confusing now, but I hope it'll make sense later. So we don't super have seams for this front piece. In fact, I don't think we have any. They're hems. So in this case, it would be a hem allowance, but we'll just stick with seam allowance because that's just easier. So seam allowance, hem allowance, right? So this front piece doesn't have a seam allowance, it just has hems because you're going to fold your edges over because you don't want raw edges because raw edges are ugly and unfinished and that's not sewing, right? So we finish our edges to make them beautiful and lovely and nice, right? And what you'll need for this part is you'll need a very large paper. So if you have some really big paper, awesome. If not, you can tape some smaller pieces together. If you tape smaller pieces together, you're going to want to use this kind of tape, the matte finish, because you can write on it, right? So we use this type when we're patterning, because we can write on top of it. If you use the transparent tape or the kind that has like the glossy finish, then you can't write on top of it, and that makes your job as a pattern maker harder, right? All right. So I have my apron, and there are just a few measurements I need. I need to determine how long I wanted it, and this is about knee length, right? So that's where I can take my measuring tape, and I can determine the length. The first thing I'm going to do though, and you can do this, of course, you're not going to have an apron to measure, but you can kind of guess. So kind of above your chest, above bust, you're going to kind of measure just from edge to edge, right? And for me, that's about 10 1/4-ish, right? And again, this is without seam allowance. So write these things down, and we add seam allowance when we cut fabric. So that's a thing, keep that in mind. So I know what this measurement at the top is, and this is straight. So that's 10 1/2 inches straight, right? Then I need to determine kind of where my waist is. So I can go down from here and say, I want this to sit kind of maybe, that's definitely above my natural waist is where this is sitting. So I went down 11 inches, and I was like, that's about where I want that, right? And then from there, I can be, and how far do I want it to go down? And for me, that was about 27 inches. So I know from here to here is 27 inches, and I know from here to wherever I want was, what was that, like 10 or whatever it was, right? So I've got this length, right? So now I've got pretty much my whole length, my top thing, and then I just need to kind of figure out my curves. So this is going to be a little bit harder for me to explain. So I'm going to do this in like a small scale. We'll see how it works. All right, so I'm just going to do this in tiny form. So Raggedy Ann here is going to help us out because I think that'll be a little bit easier, you know, to see everything all at once. What I'm doing is I'm going to go across, and Raggedy Ann already has an apron, so that's nice, that's cute, but we're going to take that off for now. All right, so we're going to go across Raggedy Ann's chest, and let's say maybe like 3/4 of an inch is pretty good. So 3/4 of an inch is going to be my top part, right? I'm going to go this way, 3/4 of an inch. So that's the top of my apron. Now I'm going to determine how far I need to go down to waist, and we'll just follow. She's got this waist seam in her dress, and that's hitting at about 7/8. Maybe I'll go just actually a little bit lower. Let's do 3/4 of an inch, right? So I'm going to go down 3/4 of an inch, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut this guy in half. So this is 3/4. So now I'm going to do half of 3/4, which is 3/8. 1, 2, 3. So that's my midpoint. And I'm just going to draw that line straight down. And this is going to be my grain line too. So this is my grain line, my straight. Well, that does not look straight. I want to make sure that this line is perpendicular to the top one. It's got to be totally perpendicular, and that one was skewing just a little bit, it felt like. Yeah, I see how that was just slightly off, but now it's not. Now it's nice and straight, right? Well, my eraser's not very good. So if your eraser doesn't work well while you're patterning, you can just hatch out lines like that, and that's great. So I just went kind of all the way down, longer than what I think I'm going to need, right? So I have this, and then we're going to go down. I think it was 3/4 of an inch is pretty good. So I'm going to go down 3/4. And of course, you'll do this with human measurements, but here you go. And I'm going to make a line this way, right? And now I'm going to just do this full, I think probably like 2 inches would be pretty good for the length, the total length. So I'm going to go from the top. I could also have measured from the waistline. So kind of that waistband and gone down and added, what, 1 inch and 3/8-ish. And I guess it was 1 1/4 is what I decided. But yeah, so I've got that. And now I can make that line perpendicular to this grain line. Now I'm going to decide kind of how wide I want this. So you usually want your aprons to go to side seam or a little bit past. So I'm going to measure on her kind of past the side seam and up to the front. So I think that's going to be about 1 inch. Ugh. I'm trying to make her not move around as much. Gotta hold that still. But I do. I think 1 inch is going to be pretty good. So you want to go just like a little bit past that. So 1 inch either way. So that's great. Now I can also do 1 inch either way from this bottom bit. And then I just connect those. And this should be parallel to my grain line, which is this line in the middle. I'm going to go like that to make it a grain line. You add arrows, top and bottom, to a grain line. A grain line it should be 2 inches or longer at least. We're making a doll's thing right now, so it's probably not going to be quite 2 inches, but that's okay. Oh, I think that line is slightly off. All right. So now we just need to connect these, and we want these to have a bit of a curve, because coming around here, you can see she's got an arm side here, where an arm side is the seam where your dress will meet, or shirts or whatever it is, meets your sleeve. So it's the seam that your sleeve goes into. It's called an arm side. Arm side with a C and a Y. It is not arm's eye. I've heard that a lot where people are like, did you know there's a seam called arm's eye? Arm's eye? I'm like, no, it's arm side, but you know, there you go. Anyway, so arm side. So it's kind of an arm side kind of thing. So you can see on the body how it's kind of got a curve to go around here. So that's why we have a bit of a curve on the pattern. And that's what your variform ruler is for, because this is made for doing arm size, right? And I'm just doing a tiny little girl. So I can get just, you know, a little bit of this curve in here, but of course you'll use a lot more of your variform. We'll just make this curve like that. And then what I would want to do to make sure that that is 100% correct is I can actually just fold it in half and then just chop it there. That's not looking quite as curvy as I would want. I mean, maybe for a doll that's fine, but because, you know, we're extrapolating to make this for an actual person, you'd really want this to be pretty curved. So I'm actually gonna... And you always draw past, because that makes your points a little bit clearer. And also as you change things, it makes it easier to change them. All right, so I've got this. Now what I can do is just go like this, cut it in half, and I can grab my paper scissors, right here. Now there are two ways I could do this. I could just take this top half and then I could just cut on fold here, and then I would cut this on the fold of the fabric and have the whole thing, or I can just have the whole thing. You can do either way. Either is correct. So now I have just my basic pattern for a cute little apron for Raggedy Ann. And of course you will extrapolate this for a real human and do the same thing. So you take the same measurements that I took on her, and then you do the same thing, but it'll just be bigger. It's just easier for me to show you with a big thing because I don't have like a big table. So this is easier, I hope. I hope that made sense. So we have our base pattern now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick this up to Raggedy Ann. Hey Raggedy, how's it going? And this is where I'm going to grab my measuring tape once again. And I'm just going to go from here to here around, and that's going to be my strap. So I'm going to measure what that is. Whoop, to have it exactly meet. And that's going to be about 2.5 inches. So I'm just going to write this on this scrap for later. So 2.5 inches around. It's 2.5 inches around the neck. And then your straps need to at least be long enough to go around the whole back, right? But then you need some tie room. So for her, let's say like 3 inches, right? So I guess waist straps, we'll say 3 inches each. And that'll give me some length so that then we can tie it off, right? I can make pattern pieces if I want for this, and those would just be rectangles. So for Raggedy Ann, of course, this wouldn't be an inch. It would probably be like 1/4 of an inch thick. So let's just pretend that our 1/4 of an inch is equal to like an inch. So I'm going to do, for her neckline, she needs 2.5 inches. So I don't quite have 2.5 inches this way, but you know, let's just pretend it is 2.5 inches. And then I would have, well, 1/4 of an inch. And then I decide whether I want this to have the grain going this way or this way, which of course you don't just draw it on, you would use a ruler. But anyway, so I can look at the pattern and kind of determine which way I want it to go. And then I would cut out this rectangle piece. And then I would do the same thing for the length ones, where I just make sure that they are 3 inches long, and then this would be like 3/8 of an inch wide, right? So I could cut those pieces and have them as pattern pieces if I wanted. I can also just wait and just cut rectangles out of my fabric, which is what I'm going to do because I'm trying to make this super simple for you, right? What I can do at this point, though, I think I would make a pattern piece for, I would maybe recommend for you to make a pattern piece for the pockets. I'm not going to, but if you want to make little pockets, I could look at this and say, okay, I want, you can kind of use your hands and see where they fall. And hers would never be able to go into pockets, but if I were to do pockets for her, they might wind up like right here-ish. So I might mark that of, they're probably going to wind up here. And of course I'd true these lines up with my ruler to make it perfect. But I can kind of look at that, and that's the placement I want on the apron. So I can see that that's probably like 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch. And let's just make it a perfect square, right? Just make it perfect. Perfectly square. Cool. So now I've got like a little square that I could cut out, and that would be my pocket, and it would go kind of in that place, right? And then I just use that twice. I don't need to make 2 of them, I just use the same piece to cut out 2 of them, right? So 1 pattern piece to cut 2 pieces. Same pattern piece, don't need to make duplicates, right? I hope that makes sense. So yes, I have my main piece, your pocket, whatever you want. I could make this a heart shaped if I wanted. I could turn it into like, I don't know, a triangle. I could do anything. That's why, like, if you want to make a pattern piece, go ahead, especially if you're going to do some weird shape. So yeah, you can do whatever shape. You could do a thing. I think hearts are really popular on aprons. So whatever you want, do a thing. Have some fun. Just make sure that it's going to fit, and make sure you center it, or, you know, you just mark your placement and make it even on either side. Unless you don't want even, then that's fine too. All right, so we've got our pattern pieces. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about the proper way to label a pattern. So we're going to put what the seam allowance is, and we're not using a seam allowance, and we pretty much never do in theater. Well, we use seam allowance, we just don't use them on the pattern. We don't build them into the patterns, right? So if I were to build a seam allowance into this pattern, what I would do is I would take this guy, trace it all out, and then I would add my seam allowance on top of it. So say for something of this scale, maybe I would add like, probably more like 1/8 of an inch, right? So I'd add like my 1/8 of an inch seams, right? So this would all just become kind of 1/8 of an inch bigger. Of course, I'd use my ruler and do it perfectly, but and that's how commercial patterns come, is the seam line is actually here, and that's where you stitch, and this is the cutting line, right? But we don't do that in theater. We leave our seam allowances off, and this is so that we can make our patterns really alterable for the future, so they're easy to alter. We don't have to worry about altering the seam allowances on top of what is already there, so that I could use this same pattern and pretty easily alter it for different sizes of people, for different shows and different things. All right, so we have no seam allowance, so we say NSA, no seam allowance. That's what that means, right? Now I'm going to put what this is. This is an apron, and we'll call this apron front, because, you know, technically there are other pieces. If you have this piece, then you would label that as apron neckband and apron ties, waist ties, right? And if I had the pocket, apron pocket. Now I need to know how many of these I cut. We cut 1 of these, right? Cut 1. If I were to interface this piece, I could cut 1 of this, and cut 1 interfacing. There's no interfacing, so we don't need to worry about that, right? So apron front, cut 1, no seam allowance. Now we're going to put the size. So usually that's the dress form size, which is not even close to the same size as vanity sizing on things. So pretty average size would be a size 12. We'll just pretend Raggedy Ann's size 12. Pretty normal, right? So size 12. And with that I could add like chest, maybe like 35, waist 29, right? Inches, right? So I could add some measurements on there if I wanted. Now I'm also going to write the actor/actress and the role that they're playing. So this is Raggedy Ann. Well, that G is funny, but whatever. Raggedy Ann, and we'll say as chef, right? So Raggedy Ann as chef. So I've got the actor, the part they're playing, and then this would be the show. I don't know what show this would be. This is For Fun is the show. All right, so I've got all of those things on, and that's so that later when I'm looking at show photos and I'm like, oh man, I really liked that. Can we use that same pattern for this other thing, for this other show? I can just go and get that pretty easily, and I know who that actress is, so I'm like, oh, you know what? She's actually in this other thing too, or, you know, someone similarly sized. We can use this for her, right? Yeah, and then you're going to write who you are. So this is, I'm the draper or pattern maker, and that's me, Sarah Beth. Whoop. And that's most of the information that you'll need. You might need to write a few other things, like if I had, I don't know, like an arm side, or if this was like going into something, it might be like shoulder seam or this or that. Like you could make some other markings, but these are the basics that you're going to want on pretty much every pattern. You'll also want to mark center front. You can say CF, or if it's center back of a pattern piece, you can say CB for center back. But that's just an important thing to note, because we know that center front has to be on straight grain. And it's also important for just placement to make sure, yep, this is the center front of my garment, right? So that's important. If I were to add seams and this was gonna, maybe have a back panel or something, then I might mark these as side seams, SS. So you can also mark your seams, because once you've got a million pattern pieces, you're not gonna know what they are, right? And that's also why we called this apron front, so that then we would label the other pieces like apron side front, or side back, or apron back, or whatever it is, right? So you just want to label your pieces so that you can keep everything organized when you have a million of them, right? So yeah, so that's how you label a pattern. All right, I hope that was clear with Raggedy Ann, but if not, we'll just go over this real person size. So once I have this, I can hold it up to me, and then I can use my measuring tape to see what circumference I need to do this. For this apron to sit where I want it to do, and for me to have a neck thing. This is sitting at 19¼ inches. I have written on my pattern 19 inches. Boop. So I'm just going to use 19 because that's what I've done in the past and what worked. So I know what this measurement is. And this is just going to be a rectangle. So it's going to be that measurement this way. And then finished, I want this to be 1 inch. We'll talk about how we need to double that and add seam allowance later. But for now, we just write down those measurements, right? Now, I've got this, and you can see it goes a little bit past my side seam. My side seams are usually like, oh, yeah, like right here, right? Going a bit past that. So I know the minimum amount I need is enough to go across here and tie a knot, right? So minimum I need is like 13 inches between the two of them with a knot. What I have done before, I have like a 1½ inch overlap here. So I'm going to include that 1½ inch overlap in my measurement. And I have 29½ inches. So I have 29½ inches this way. And I made the width 1½ inches, right? I'm also looking at the pocket, and the pockets I did last time I think are a little bit small. I think I'd like some bigger pockets. So my width on these is 5 inches. My length is 6. So I think I want them to be longer. So I might do like 8 inch by 8 inch square. And I think that might be nice. It's going to take up a lot more space, and I don't think it's going to look as nice, but I think it's going to be more functional, so I'm going to do that. So I'm going to write that down of 8 inch square. And if you want, you can just write these on the pattern so that next time you do this, you don't have to be like, oh, let me just remeasure, right? Or you could, because people change over time. That's just the way that bodies work. So you could also be like, in 3 years when I do this again, let me check my measurements again and make it exactly for my body at that time. Because that's how bodies work, and that's totally fine. All right, let's start with the neck strap. So I know finished, I want it to be 1 inch wide, and it has to be 19 inches long, right? Now, I can't just leave it there, right? So the 1 inch, it's going to have to be folded over, right? It's going to be a folded piece of fabric. That's how we get finished edge. So I know that this has to be 2 inches of fabric just to wrap around. Let me show you. So here, I have 1 inch of fabric here, but the other side is also fabric. What? Yeah, so it's folded, right? So I know that I have to have 2 inches at least to have my neck band, right? My neck strap. Now, again, there's a seam in here, right? I've sewn a seam, and so there's fabric on the inside which I don't know, you can probably see that there is bulk here that there just isn't over here. So because I've got that bulk there, I've got to have some kind of seam allowance in there, right? And it looks like I probably did like 3/8 of an inch. I didn't use something that was super thick. Now, a lot of times on like straps or small like collars and things, you will see a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Pretty much everywhere else, you use 5/8. So there are some occasions where you go down to about 3/8, and it looks like I did that here. So I'm going to go ahead and add 3/8. But I need that times 2 because there's this fabric and this fabric, and each has to have the seam allowance in there, right? So all I got to do is add those together. It's 2 inches plus 3/8 times 2. 3/8 times 2 is 3/4. So I know that finished, so this is how it is finished. But when I cut it, my cutting length, the width is going to be 2 3/4 inches, right? Now my length for this guy, again, I have to have some kind of overlap. So this one I did like a little underlap. It's underneath. Ugh, that's not pretty stitching. Don't look at it. So I've only got like just a tiny little bit. That's like 3/8 of an inch. And I think I want more. I think I want a full flippin' inch. So I'm going to add an inch to either side. And that's just so that I have overlap here. And inside of that, though, is still a seam allowance because there's a seam there, and I've still got to have stuff in there. So I have my 19 inches, but I'm going to add 2 inches because 1 inch for this side, 1 inch for this side, and that's like the seam allowance for attachment. But the seam allowance for the strap inside, I'm going to go ahead and use 3/8 again. So I'm going to do 3/8 times 2, which is again 3/4, right? So for this, I have 19 plus 2 plus 3/4. So my cutting length is going to be 21 3/4 inches. So now I know exactly what this is. This is a rectangle. Whoop. And this is 2 3/4 inches. And this is 21 3/4 inches. Right? So that's what I'm going to cut it down to for it to be finished like this. Hope that makes sense. All right, now let's do the waist strap. So this one's a little bit thicker. So if finished, it's 1.5 inches, right? But again, I've got 2 sides to this, so I need to multiply that by 2. So finished, it's going to be 1.5 inch width, which means I know that it's got to be 3 inches at least, right? Because I got this side and this side. Now, again, I've got a seam here, and then I have to have the seam allowance, which if I fold over, you can feel that bulk. It's about there. Again, that's about 3/8 of an inch. So, plus 3/8 of an inch. And remember, there's 2 of those because you got 2 sides of fabric, which is 3/4 inches. So I know 3 3/4 inches is my cutting width. Right? I'm also just going to write up here that I'm making a pocket. And finished, it's going to be 8 inches by 8 inches. And if I use 5/8 of an inch seam allowance around that, that means I have to add 5/8 here, 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 and here. So I just add 5/8 times 2 to both of these. So 5/8 times 2, which of course is 5/4, which is the same as 1 1/4, right? So I know that my pocket, to cut my pocket, it's going to be 9 1/4 inches by 9 1/4 inches, right? So that's my pocket. All right, back down to my waist strap. So I've got my width, and then my length. My length was 29.5 inches finished. So I'm going to put finished length is 29.5 inches. Now I've got a beautiful nice square here of overlapping that's about 1.5 inches So I'm going to add 1.5 inches to this guy, just on the one side because it's only connected in one place. The other one is free because that's just free hanging, right? So I'm going to add 1.5 inches. And then once again, I've got a seam allowance up in here because there is a seam. And then I have a seam allowance on the other edge. Right? So I've got a seam allowance there. So each of those, I'm going to do 3/8. So 3/8 times 2, which is, of course, again, 3/4 of an inch. So if I add all of these together, blop, blop, we got 31 3/4. So this is my cutting length. Great. So plug in your numbers for each of the things for neck length and for, however long you want your waist ties to be. And you can use this same equation. I know it's messy and my handwriting is terrible, and it's especially terrible with my tendons, what they are, but I'm sorry, there it is. So yeah, these are our measurements. So now I can be like, that's my pocket. And let me see. That's my neck strap. And then my waist strap. This one. This one. Right? All right, let's cut these pieces. Oh no, my pattern is all folded up. How do I make it flat and nice again? You can actually use your iron on like a low heat setting, somewhere in here. Don't use steam. But you can use your iron to iron paper as well. So when you get commercial patterns from the store, you'll want to iron them out all nice. Also, if you're storing your pattern, you can definitely fold it up, that's fine, because you can just iron it out later. All right, let's talk about the properties of fabric, because this is going to be really important to understand when you're cutting fabric. So there are fibers and there are textiles, right? So the fiber content of this is 100% cotton. Cotton is a fiber that is then used to spin the thread, and then the thread is used to weave this fabric because this is a woven fabric. That's the textile, right? So there are different types of weaves, and there are also non-woven fabrics. Those are kind of the two major distinctions. So a woven fabric is woven, right? And there are lots of different types of weaves. This is just a plain weave. There's herringbone weave, which is one that we use making corsets. So coutil is woven with a herringbone weave that makes it stronger and better for corsets, right? So there are different types of weaves. There are lots of different types, and they each have their own purposes and their looks and how they're made, right? So there are weaves, and then there are knit fabrics, something like, well, this is actually its own monster. But a lot of t-shirts, those are woven. Not woven, sorry. Those are knitted. So those are knitted, and that's like one thread that's basically gone through and loop, 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 loop. So that's a series of loops. And that has its own techniques. Knitted fabrics and stretch fabrics have their own sewing techniques. Maybe we'll get to those one of these days. But for now, we're going to deal with woven fabrics. There are also, in non-wovens, there are also felts. So felt is basically where you just take these fibers and kind of smush them on top to make a fabric. And that's its own monster as well. It doesn't have too many different techniques, but it does have, there are some things. And then you have things like tulle, like this guy, and lace, and a whole ton of other things, right? But for now, we're going to focus on woven fabrics. So this is a woven fabric. Woven fabrics are your most common type of fabric when you're making things. Yeah, they're the things. So a lot of the rules kind of revolve around woven fabrics. I am using a fabric with a stripe, not only because it's mine, I designed it and I love it, but also because I think this will help you see the concept of selvage a little bit easier. So when fabrics are woven, they're stuck onto a loom, and they're stuck on this way, right? So these threads that go this way, the ones that are parallel to all of my lines, these threads are put on first. And then the threads that go this way are woven second. This is important because these threads are called the warp. And the warp is also called the selvage, right? This is the selvage. It's also called the grain line, right? So these threads all go this way, right? These are the strongest threads. Your cross grain, ones going this way, also called weft, these are less strong. So the strongest threads should always run parallel to your body this way. That's how that should go, right? Straight up and down, just like these stripes, right? That's how this edge should go. If you sew it like this, it won't be as strong, right? That's also why you have these edges at the end. This is kind of where the threads going this way end, right? Or loop around, right? So we have these threads. That's why you have like this kind of fluff here, right? So the reason this matters is because if you cut something off grain, it's gonna want to sit on grain. And this is really weird, but if you buy a pair of jeans, and I'm a millennial, so people in my day wore jeans. I don't know what your kids are wearing. I don't know what anyone's wearing. I was never a huge fan of jeans, but jeans, right? If you get a pair of jeans and it's twisting, so like the seams ought to sit straight, right? They ought to sit straight from your crotch and they ought to sit straight from your outseam. Inseam, outseam, they should be pretty straight on the edges, right? A lot of jeans will twist and they'll go like this, right? So that seam that ought to be here is like sitting over here and over here, which is weird. And you'll always want to be adjusting it and pushing it and doing that, right? The reason that happens is because it was cut off grain. So what they should have done is they should have cut it with this as the straight grain, right? Instead, they cut it slightly off, but it doesn't want to sit that way. It wants to be parallel to your body. So if you cut it off, if it's wrong, it's going to twist itself to always be trying to compensate and go back to straight of grain. So if you cut something off grain, it will be wrong forever, and it will forever be trying to go back to where it should be. So jeans, they'll do that because they're made in factories and they want to save fabric, and sometimes it's cheaper and you can conserve more fabric by cutting things off grain. Then you could fit more pieces in, right? So it's an economical decision and a bad craftsman decision. That's how you get crap, right? So we don't do that. No. We're not going to do that. We're going to make things beautiful and perfect and cut on grain. All right, so that's why it's important. Especially your center front and your center back, those should be cut straight of grain, right? I hope that makes sense. I think it'll make more sense as we go throughout and as you start sewing. There is one other alternative, and that's the bias, and that's when things are cut at a 45-degree angle, right? So it's cut 45 degrees from your selvage edge, right? And that's where you get the most stretch. You can see that's like stretching, right? So you can cut things on bias, and that's where you get bias cut dresses. And there are a lot of techniques with that, but we're not going to deal with that now. But if you're going to cut fabric, you need to cut it either on the selvage, or you can have cross grain, because it won't be as strong, but it'll still be straight, right? Or you can do 45-degree angle and have that bias, right? Anything else is wrong. And it's going to be wanting to force itself into the right position, right? All right, so hope that helps. Let's cut some fabric. All right, I should clarify something real fast. You need to know how much fabric you're gonna use, right? So once you've made your pattern, you can just measure it, and this is gonna be the selvage edge. So I can just measure down the center front, and for me it's 32.5-ish inches, right? So I know that this is gonna take about a yard to create, right? I also know that my other tabs are 29.5 inches, and nothing is longer than that, right? So now I know a yard is 36 inches because a yard is 3 feet. So fabric is sold by the yard in this country. So I know that I should get 1 yard. If you're wanting to make this longer, so this is what is called a full apron because it covers the top and the bottom. A half apron is just the bottom section. And you could absolutely do that, and you could get away with maybe like 3/4 of a yard with this. If I wanted to make this go all the way to the floor, you'd want more fabric, right? So what you can do is take your pattern, measure, and that will tell you how much you need, right? Remember, we're gonna have a seam allowance on the bottom and on the top, so leave yourself a little space for that. So yeah, a yard would be perfect for this. Fabric also comes in different widths. So I believe this is about 45 inches. 44 looks like. So let's cut out our fabric. And I have floor space, I don't have table space, and I don't have very much floor space, so we'll do this on the floor. It might be a little tight, but that's that. All right, so you will need for this part your pattern, a ruler, water-soluble pencil, pencil sharpener, fabric scissors, and push pins. All right? Should I just lay it out like this and just draw this on and cut it out? No, absolutely not. There are a few things we need to do. We need to add a seam allowance, so that we have our edges so that they can be finished really nicely. Also, I want to apologize because my hands are like super awkward right now because I have de Quervain's tendinovitis in this hand and early trigger thumb in this hand, and today I just got these injections, and oh my goodness, this one hurt like the dickens. Anyway, so I got some injections in my hands and on my wrists. And they hurt. Anyway, so sorry about that. So my hands are a little funky. But anyway, we're gonna cut this out. Okay, so we need to add a seam allowance, boop boop, and that's where we have these pencil, right? Do I cut from this side of the fabric? No, absolutely not also, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna flip this over. You always cut and do your markings on the wrong side of the fabric so that if for some reason they're visible, they're not going to be visible from the outside, right? So if I were to do my markings on this side and then say I was off in my sewing by a little bit, then those markings still might be visible. And the water-soluble pencils are really great, and they are soluble in water. So if I make this and then I wash it, the pencil markings should go away. On the off chance that they don't go away, I don't want them to stay in the outside of my garment. I want them to stay in the inside where nobody will see, and hopefully it won't bleed through, and if it does, that's really sad, and that's a bummer. So water-soluble pencils are the best, so use these, right? Okay, now we're going to talk about 2 other things real fast. We're going to talk about fabric. So remember how we talked about weave and the selvage edge? That needs to be kept in mind the whole time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second when we're pinning the pattern piece. But for now, what I want to talk about is a pattern. So I have a stripe, but I don't know yet if this stripe is on grain because this is a print. So what they do is they take this and they print it on top of the fabric, which means the print might not align with the selvage edge, which means my stripes might not be on grain. Oh no! So this is the sad part about printed fabrics, is you can get fabrics that aren't printed on grain. Versus if this were woven, then these, the threads would be colored beforehand, and we would see on this side that same color of, this gold or that brown or whatever. We'd see the same colors, and it would be the same thread going throughout, right? So we know this isn't that because that's a printed fabric, right? And so we know that this could be skewed. So I'm just gonna test right here to see, I'm gonna measure where this stripe falls in relation to my selvage edge. And if it's on grain, then these lines should all be parallel to the grain line, right? So let's check. And actually it looks pretty good. I think they did a pretty good job of alignment because it looks like it's 3/4 from the edge, both top and bottom. It's hitting it kind of that same spot. So that means that it is aligned from here to here at the very least. And if it's aligned and straight from here, it's probably going to be aligned the rest of the way. So after doing that measurement, I can say, yes, I'm pretty sure that these lines are all on grain. What I could do also is I could kind of open this up and I could pull one of these threads and I could see if what I'm pulling is entirely a pink thread. Or if it skews into the blue and it turns blue down here kind of as I pull it, right? So you can kind of figure out a few different ways whether the print is on grain or not. If you have a print that's off grain, it's not really suitable for textiles. That's something where you can use that for, making, I don't want to use the word crafts because costume crafts is something totally different in costumes, but that's like the craftier things, like objects rather than clothing items. So not costume crafts, not costumes, just like, I don't know, like pillowcases and pin cushions and other things, right? But this one is on grain, so perfect, how great, how suitable for us. That's awesome. All right. So we know this is on grain. That's lovely because that means that each of these stripes is going to be on grain. So I can measure things from these stripes, which is awesome. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this fabric over. And we are going to do this on the wrong side of the fabric. This is wrong side. That's the terminology of this is the wrong side because it's not the side facing out, right? And this is right side of fabric, right? All right. Now a few quick things. If I were to fold this in half, and if you only cut the half, then you need to cut it on fold, right? Now, what a lot of people do is they'll fold the fabric in half and they'll use this middle piece. Now, this breaks my first law. This is the law of conservation of fabric. This is Sarah Beth's law. All right, if you cut this out here, you have wasted this section of fabric and this section of fabric. You are not conserving your fabric, right? So now I have two strips that I'm way less likely to use than if I were to do this, because guess what? You can fold other places than the middle, and you just gotta measure, right? So if I were doing that, fold it over here, and because I have a stripe, what I could do is I could pick a stripe. Maybe I'll pick this skinny little pink one, and I could follow that all the way down and just fold on that. And now I know it's exactly perfect all the way down, right? Like the exact same distance the whole way down on grain, right? Because the fold has to be on grain whenever you cut on fold, right? Now I have this whole section over here that is one piece, and I can do so much more with this, right, than I could with those two little strips on either side. So I've conserved my fabric for future use. It drives me crazy when students don't do this, because then I have pieces of fabric with something weird cut out of the middle. And it's so wasteful, so don't do that, right? It's not good for the environment. It's not good for your wallet. It's not good for the school's wallet. Don't do that, all right? The law of conservation of fabric. Follow it. Conserve your fabric, right? So, you're cutting on fold, remember? The fold is going to follow the grain line, right? Fold here and here, right? I have marked my grain line here, and that's fine. You can mark your grain line pretty much anywhere as long as it is a parallel line that is parallel to center front or center back, right? It gets more complicated when you get like side panels and other pieces, but pretty much what you want is parallel to the body, right? So there we go. Now, if you went ahead and cut your other pieces out, then you're going to want to place them all before you cut. So all of your pieces go down. The reason is then you can see your whole fabric layout, your cutting layout, and you can conserve fabric. Again, the law of conservation of fabric. Follow it. If I have a strip here and then, you know, something wonky here and here, right? Like I just want to think about all of my spaces and how I can maximize their usage, right? So I want to really think about that. Another thing to keep in mind is these edges you cannot use and should not use. I mean, technically you could, but usually like a quarter to a half an inch. It depends kind of on what your selvage edge looks like. Sometimes they'll have, like on this side, they'll have like holes from needle burn kind of like burnt through them. And you just don't want to cut in that area. So again, I'll have students trying to use like on a print that's like this white section, you don't want to use this at all. You don't even want it in your seam allowance. There are a few different reasons. One is if I'm doing my seam allowance, then I could wind up with like a little bit showing through. And then I have a white edge, which I don't want. I want just the beautiful print of the fabric, right? So I could change things. Another reason is in our seam allowances for theater, we like to use larger seam allowances so that this can be used later for a different actor, right? And if I don't actually have that full seam allowance of the fabric, if it turns into white in that seam allowance, then I can't use that, right? I can't use that to the full extent that I would want to use. So you want to ignore these edges. And I know it seems like you're conserving fabric if you don't, but trust me, you don't want to mess with those, right? So it's easy to see on a print like this, but a lot of other fabrics that aren't prints, like something like this, is just going to have like a selvage edge. It's just going to look like this from it and like just have like half an inch of maybe a slightly textured different fabric, or the edge will be just like a little bit different. And you can look at it like right here, I've got just like a quarter of an inch, and it's slightly darker because the fibers are a little bit more densely woven in those places, right? So again, you just kind of want to ignore that section because that's not meant to be used. It's you know, it's a finished edge. It's tempting. Trust me, just ignore it. Don't use it, right? Now, can I just plop this down wherever I want and cut? No. 2 reasons. Remember, we're conserving fabric, and that would be just a waste to do like that. Other reason, we have to follow the grain line, right? I also want to leave enough at the top, sides, and bottom so that I can add my seam allowance later. So I want enough over from the edge so I can have that. Right, but I also want to conserve as much fabric as possible while also leaving myself that space. So I'm going to do something kind of like this, right? Now, I don't just eyeball it. You never just eyeball it. And that's why we have push pins. I'm going to dump a few here. Oh, I'm using push pins because I'm doing this on a carpeted floor. If you're not using a carpeted floor or a corkboard tabletop, which is what we use in theater, the alternative is if you can use fabric weights. So then you just put those, and those are just weights that kind of hold your pieces on top. You can also use random objects, like sometimes I'll use my Go board pieces. So I can use those because they're pretty heavy, they're pretty solid. So you can also just use like random stuff that's gonna hold things down, right? But most ideal, you have like a pretty squishy surface that you can stick push pins into. All right, so I've kind of put this kind of about where I want, and now you have to use your ruler. If you don't use your ruler, you're wrong. So I've got my grain line, and I'm gonna match that up to the 1 inch. And now I need to make sure that this is parallel to this. And I'm super close, very, very, very close. But I am off just a tiny bit. And this is why you can't eyeball it, because even that tiny bit, it's like a 1/16 of an inch, that changes everything. Perfect. All right, so I was pretty close. You might not be the first time you put it down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pin on either side of this grain line, because I know that that is perfectly on grain, right? So then from there, I can pin everything else. And I know that this line is also should be on grain because that's center front. So if I'm worried about whether I'm going off grain, I can also just measure it up here. And that's looking pretty parallel, pretty nice. So I'm feeling good. All right, this looks like a great layout. I've left enough room. We're going to use a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, right? 5/8 is really common seam allowance. That is the most normal in commercial patterns. So if you buy a pattern from a store, it's going to tell you 5/8 of an inch seam allowance for almost everything, right? So we're going to use that. In theater, we use 1 inch really frequently. Sometimes we use 3/4 of an inch. But for the most part, at the theaters I've worked at this point, most of the time we're either going to use 1 inch or 5/8. So those are the two main ones. For this, don't worry about anything else, just 5/8 of an inch, right? So what I'm going to do next is I'm actually just going to trace my pattern with my water-soluble pencil. And this is something we do in theater because what I'm tracing now is my seam line. This is where I'm stitching. And it's really easy for a draper to trace this out and then hand it off to a stitcher and they have the exact stitching line. So even if they don't know the seam allowance, they get this and the seam is marked so they don't even need to know the seam allowance. You should tell them just because, but yeah, that's nice. So yeah, so you know that's your seam line. We're not doing seams really because these are really just kind of going to be hems, but same concept. Awesome. And these water-soluble pencils wear down really quickly, so you always want to have your sharpener with you because you'll need it. And I don't recommend using an electrical pencil sharpener for these, just because they're really soft. All right, so now that I have traced this out, now I'm going to use my ruler and I am going to take out these sections one at a time and I'm going to mark 5/8 of an inch away from these. And you see how I left myself, there's the white, but the actual pattern ends right here, maybe like 1/8 of an inch or less, a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch away from here. So that's perfect. I left myself just a little bit extra, but not enough to be wasteful. And that is exactly what you want. Conserve your fabric. All right? All right, so I can draw my lines. Boop, boop. And now I can put these ones, some of these back in. I'll start over here and do this side now. And when you're doing like a curved edge like this one, you just break it up. I'm going to start by doing here, and then you just kind of tilt your ruler as you go along, right? And I can get that nice, beautiful curved edge. There we go. Beautiful, right? Put these pins back. So I'm just going to trace out all of my edges 5/8 of an inch away. And what I'm doing is I'm lining it up with the edge of the paper, not necessarily where your line is, because your line will inevitably be farther away. And then if you then measure from that, like the line that's drawn, then you're compounding your mistake. Not that it's a mistake, but you're not making it as precise as you could. So I'm going 5/8 of an inch away from the paper. Exactly. Right? Replacing my pins as I go along. Alright, so I used my water-soluble pencil and I used pink. It comes in 3 colors. There's white, there's pink, and there's blue. You always want to use the fabric pencil that is going to match your fabric and blend in the most if it doesn't come out. So I chose the pink just because it has to stand out, so I can't use the white on white, obviously. So obviously it cannot be the exact same color. That doesn't work. But I also don't want to use the blue because the blue on this, if it doesn't come out of that white, that's going to be a problem. But the pink, even from here, after I've traced it, you can kind of see the edges that I've done, boop, boop, from this distance. But it's hard. It's hard. It's there, but it's very hard to see. And that's good because from a distance, we don't want people to be able to see this just in case it doesn't come out. And especially in theater, hopefully the nearest audience member is going to be like 20 feet away. So if we can't see it from here, just maybe like, I don't know, 5 feet in front of it, then they for sure can't see it from 20 feet away. And that's the goal, right? Okie dokie, artichoke. Alright, so I've got this all traced out. And then, of course, if I had any other pieces, I'd trace around them. I would have laid them down beforehand to have, my perfect layout. But I'm going to think about my other pieces right now, right? Because I decided I think I was going to do like an 8x8 square for my pockets. And I'm going to see if I can fit that into this section. I think I almost could here, but I think it's not going to work here because there's not enough distance. Yep, that's going to not work here. So I can get probably that square out of here, and that'll work. And I know I can get my rectangles out of this section. So I've decided, just because this is going to be easier for me, that my rectangles I'm going to cut this way. I could make them go cross grain, and then this would match up with this, but then I'd want to cut that down there, and that would be a thing. Anyway, so I'm going to choose to not have them all be parallel to grain, and that's okay. I can make that choice as long as it is parallel to either the grain line or the cross grain, or it's on the bias, right? Those are my 3 options. I have to pick one of those, right? So I'm going to decide that they're going to go this way. So that means they're going to be opposite of the way that the stripes on this are going to be. And I like that. I think that's going to be cute. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to think about those pieces later, and for now I'm going to cut out. When you cut, you leave your pins in there. It's going to make it easier, and it's make it so that the fabric doesn't shift as much. This is going to matter a lot for a fabric like this that's pretty shifty. For this it matters a little bit less, but it's still just nice, easy. I'm going to just cut on my cutting line. And that's what I've marked, right? The 5 inches away from it. You cannot cut on your seam line because then you have nothing to sew, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about grain line because it is so essential and so important, right? So I've got just a section of this that I cut out, right? And I'm going to show you a cool thing about a grain line. All right, so I know that the grain should be parallel to my stripes. So I can make a little bit of a cut and then rip. And I have ripped exactly on the grain line, right? You can do this cross grain. So let me show you cross grain. So here's cross grain also rips that way, right? Because I have fibers being woven this way, and then intertwining fibers, whoop, come in and doing a thing, right? And then this one's going to do the opposite, something like that, right? So these fibers are woven, and you can make a cut and then just rip across to have those straight woven threads come right out, right? So I know that this is exactly cross grain and that this is exactly on grain because I could just literally pull a thread away, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so I can just pull those threads away, right? Thread by thread. And that just means it's straight and I can rip it in those places, which is pretty cool. So with the plain weave, you can get away with this. You can do this. I don't recommend using this technique for when you're cutting your garment because you want those lines to be nice and straight. And you can see that where I tore it, it kind of pulled some of these fibers a little bit. So it's kind of pulling them in kind of wonky ways that I don't super love. Yeah, you can just see that the fabric is kind of changed for about 1/4 of an inch past where I've kind of held it to rip. So it kind of warps it a little bit when you do that. So it's not ideal to do that for cutting. It's much better to just cut it out with scissors, because then you don't get like 1/4 of an inch being kind of funny after that, right? But that's a cool thing, and you can do this especially with like a bolt of muslin when you're pulling off a piece and then you just give it a snip and you can rip it. And it's a very satisfying sound. It's pretty great. So yeah, that's how fabric works with a plain weave. Kind of cool, right? So now that this is cut out, this is how it should look, right? Got my seam allowance sticking out, and this is how all patterns that you cut for theater should be. Of making the pattern that doesn't have the seam allowance and then drawing in the seam allowance on the fabric before you cut, cutting it out on that line. This is how it should be, right? So now I can pull this off, and I'm actually gonna just kind of roll this over and keep it with the pattern piece. This is something that I was taught in theater as well, that you keep the pattern piece with the piece that you cut out, because sometimes you're cutting pieces that are really similar looking, and it's important to be like, this rectangle is for here and this other rectangle is for here, right? So it just helps you keep track of what piece is what. You can write on the back of the fabric what something is if you're afraid you might not know or remember, but I think the easiest way is to just keep it with its pattern piece. We know that we need 2 of the long rectangles for our waist strap, and then we're going to do a neck strap, and then we need to make 2 pockets, right? So I'm actually going to grab a hard surface just because it'll make it easier for me using my ruler and drawing on this. And all I gotta do is draw these rectangles, and I can just do the finished measurements that I have. So let's see, my waist strap is 3 3/4 inches. So I'm just gonna use this very edge of this fabric, of like right where my pattern starts, because I know that's gonna be on straight grain. So I'm gonna use that as my edge, and I'm gonna go 3 3/4 inches away from that. 3 3/4. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, just down a little bit. So 3 3/4. Cool. Straighten that back out. And then you do that maybe one more time real fast. And if it wasn't the edge of this, I could just, measure, giving myself some distance from the selvage edge. My hands hurt. I don't know if I'll finish this today. All right. So now what I can do, I'm going to twist my board, find my markings, and I'm just going to connect them with a straight line. Oh. All right, so the length is going to be 31 3/4 inches. So I'm going to measure again from kind of the edge of where my pattern starts, and I could give myself a little distance in each of those places, but I think I can be pretty precise, so I will. So I'm just going to mark 15 to begin. And then just 31 3/4. 15 is what fits kind of on my board underneath. So I'll just mark 15 again. And now I have 30. And then I can add 1 3/4 inches. And this one I'm gonna say, okay, that's the end of my fabric. So I can draw my line this way to get my edge. And then the length, again, is 3 3/4. So I can mark that length and do the thing. Now I just want to, again, mark my 3 3/4. It ends here. So maybe I'll just do 1 in the middle. Connect those, and I have my rectangle ready to go. Now, when I use pattern pieces, I don't usually want them touching or like the edge where I cut touching. I want to give myself a little bit of space. But because these are rectangles that are all going to be parallel to the grain, I don't mind so much. So I'm actually just going to use this same line for my next one over, right? So this will be one strap, and then all I need to do is measure my 3 3/4 inches up from this line and mark that one. Again, making sure everything is parallel to my marked lines and to the selvage edge all the way, right? Okay, we're going to use interfacing now. That's what this is. It's a lightweight. This one's a lightweight. You can get it in different weights. I wouldn't use heavier than a medium for this. So a lightweight or a medium. This, you can see those kind of like little dots on this side. The dots are actually on this side, and you can feel it with your hands. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So you can feel it. What those little dots are is those are like a heat set adhesive, so that's why it's fusible. So when I use the iron with this, these fuse to my fabric. So there is a smooth side, that's this side, and then there's a rough side that has those little balls everywhere, boop, 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 and those are the adhesive. So the adhesive rough side always goes towards the fabric that you're fusing it to. If you stick it up towards the iron, you're going to gunk up your iron because it's going to melt onto the iron. It's not going to be good. So make sure that that side is always facing towards the fabric you're fusing it to, right? This type of fabric, this is a fusible interfacing, so it's got the fusing, and then it's a non-woven. So this is a non-woven fabric. It doesn't have a grain, so that means I can kind of really conserve it as much as possible and kind of cut however I want, right? So this is a lot more like a felt, where it's just kind of fibers stacked onto each other. And if I go to the edge, I can really see this, because it's just kind of fibers coming off, right? It's not like little threads that I can pull off in even lines like it is with a woven fabric, right? It's just kind of globs of fibers. So it's a non-woven, right? You can use a woven, and if you use a woven, just keep in mind the grain line, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut fusible interfacing pieces for the neck strap and the 2 waist straps, and that's it. I don't need or want this in my pocket. That's not going to work, right? So not for the pocket, just for my other 2 straps. And I'm just going to cut them the same measurements as my other pieces. So what I'm going to do is I am going to grab my ruler and my water-soluble pencil once again, and I'm going to use these guys to cut my rectangles once again, right? So think I'm going to start with my long ones. And what I can even do is I could even lay these down and kind of use them as a pattern piece, but then I would probably want to double check just to make sure it's totally perfectly right. All right, not doing the pockets, remember? I'm going to start with my long ones. My long ones are 31 3/4 inches. And let's mark 15. And then 15. Or actually we can do 16 3/4. All right, so I have my neck piece here, my neck strap. And of course I'm going to flip it over so that the right side is on top. And then I have got my interfacing, making sure that the scratchy side is going to face my fabric. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my iron. I'm just going to iron it on. So the iron heats up those little dots of adhesive. And then those heated up dots make it so the fabric is perfectly adhered. I can pull it apart. You can hear that. That it's kind of undoing the glue to do it. And you can also rip your interfacing when you do that. So basically, when you have interfacing that is fusible on a thing, it can come out over time. But it's best to not try to remove it because it's going to be messy. All right. And you just want to test it to make sure that everywhere the interfacing is really stuck to it. The reason that we're doing this is you saw the old one, and that one I was a little bit lazy on and I didn't do this step. So let me show you what the difference is going to be. Is this is going to be a nice beautiful neck band that's going to be stiff and kind of hold its shape a little bit better, versus if we don't put interfacing in, the neck is actually pretty good. You don't have to for the neckline if you don't want to. Yeah, and you can actually skip this step if you want to. You can totally skip the interfacing step. Because I did for this one. And yeah, the necklines, the neck strap looks pretty good. Let's go look though at the waistband. Do you see how like wrinkly this has become over time? You really want something that's going to be just like this, where it's kind of just stiff and nice and holds its shape and doesn't become this kind of wrinkly little mess, right? So that's why we use interfacing. The purpose is to stiffen up whatever it's adhered to make things a little bit stiffer. Yeah, it's great stuff. Would recommend. So now we're going to take our pieces and we're going to serge all the way around them, around our edges. And yeah, we're going to use a serger again. But if you don't have a serger, that's okay. Most people don't own these. That's totally fine. You can skip this step and instead you could do a zigzag stitch around the edges and try to have it be like a 1/4 inch finished. And that would be great. Technically, you can skip this step. A lot of home sewers don't do any kind of finishing, but that really hurts my soul. So like, please do some kind of finishing. It just makes your product better. It makes it last longer. It's just, right? So I would suggest zigzag stitch if you don't have a serger. Serging is the best, of course. If you have one, you're living your best life. Good for you. But yeah, so we're just gonna serge this guy. And this is great too, especially for the interfacing, because the serger, again, it has that blade, so it's going to chop off this excess. Because you might have a little extra, some like little points where there's a little extra of the interfacing that you just want to get rid of. And this will do that, so that's great. See that beautiful, nice finished edge? No more extra interfacing coming out, right? Beautiful, beautiful. Let's do the whole thing. All right, so one thing we want to be aware of is that here we do have a curve, and curves stretch because of the way that the fabric is, right? So that could be a bit of a problem here. So just as you're going through, just make sure you're not stretching it. Just keep it pretty straight, right? Otherwise, we're going to get a bit of a lettuce hem. Great, so it lays pretty flat, pretty nice, pretty good like that. So yeah, just don't pull it, right? So now we have all of the pieces cut out and serged. Oh, and the serging just makes it look so beautiful, so finished, so professional. We love it. So here we go. Here's where we're at right now. Ow. So we're gonna finally get into the sewing stage. So you're gonna select a thread. I've got a lot of colors going on here, but my most dominant color is this blue, so I think I'm going to select a thread that's pretty close to the blue. When you're selecting thread, you always want to go darker rather than lighter. Light is a highlight, it catches light. Darker can be the shadow, blends in, disappears, right? So go dark, not light, right? So I'm going to choose my thread. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do my pockets before I do anything else. And I don't need to mark where they're going to go yet, although if you want to mark that on your pattern beforehand, that's always a great thing to do. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take these, and from the wrong side, I'm going to fold them over 1/4 of an inch. And this is why we love serging, is because it's about 1/4 of an inch. And it just kind of naturally folds over that way. Okay, this is one of 10 million reasons why we love serging. It's just the best, right? So I can fold it over really nicely, and I don't even have to pin as I sew this, right? I can just fold it over naturally along that 1/4 of an inch. So I can do that and then come over here and do this edge as well. If you want a really beautiful corner, we can do what's called a mitered edge. But first we're going to do the first layer, and then we're going to flip it and we're going to do a second so that your serging is totally encased. Boop, boop. And you have a seam allowance that is 5/8 of an inch, and this is about 1/4 of an inch, right? And then we got 1/4 of an inch here. So that's 1/2 inch. So where does that extra 1/8 of an inch go? Well, that is called turn of cloth. You can see that when I fold it, there is fabric here. It's not a zero distance, right? It's not as if I'm folding two planes on each other exactly and there's no depth to it, right? So there is some fabric here, and then there's fabric again here when I flip it the second time. So that's called turn of cloth. So between the two of these, that's probably, a 1/16 of an inch here, a 1/16 of an inch there. Put together, that's 1/8 of an inch. And so you have a total seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch, right? We got 1/4, and then we got some turn of cloth here, and then we got our other 1/4 with our turn of cloth here. So that's how that works. Pretty cool, pretty cool. So yeah, so what I'm going to do is just fold these 1/4 and do that all the way around, and then I'm going to fold another 1/4 and do that all the way around. If you want, you can have kind of just a bulky edge like this. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it, but you can have a nicer, cleaner, more beautiful edge if you do a mitered edge, a mitered corner. So I will show you how to do that, but know that you don't have to do it that way. You can have just like a slightly lumpy edge, and there is nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with a little lumpy corner. But I am trying to teach you guys to have beautiful, excellent craftsmanship, so I'll teach you the mitered corner just 'cause. Alright, I'm going to use a straight stitch, and a normal stitch length for just sewing things together is between a 2 and a 3. And most machines will, if they're a computerized machine, they'll turn on with the normal stitch length being a 2.4. This is an embroidery machine, so it's slightly different, and actually has a 2.5 if I click on it. So it's got a 2.5 stitch length. So that's the thing. Anywhere between 2 and 3 is a normal stitch length, right? Larger stitches can be used for totally different things. Like a 3 is usually an ease stitch. A 4 and above can be used as a basting stitch. And then anything less than a 2, usually like 1, 1.5, that is used for reinforcement stitching. So you want to get your stitch length right, because it's going to make your product stay together for the right length of time. If it's a basting stitch, it's a longer stitch, it means you can rip it out later, right? If it's reinforcement stitching, it means the stitches are really close together and you're going to have a really hard time ripping it out. So there's a time and a place for reinforcement stitching. We're not doing anything that uses that kind of reinforcement stitching. We are going to do a stitch that's going to help us reinforce our pockets later. But yeah, so for now, stick between a 2 and a 3, and that's just the length for that. That's the style. So I'm going to go to a 2.4 just because that's normal. 4 or 5 on this machine. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold over my 1/4 of an inch. If you don't have a serger, if you didn't do any kind of finishing here, you can just kind of measure 1/4 of an inch, and you can iron it if you want, or you could pin it. With this serging, I'm just going to stitch it down. Alright, so I'm holding my threads kind of with my one finger, so I'm holding them back so that they don't get tangled up. That's a big thing that a lot of beginners will do. If you leave the thread like this, it's going to get tangled up in your stitching, and yeah, if you let go of it too soon, it'll just pull kind of funny and you'll get kind of globs of thread at the bottom. So you don't want bobbin art, it's not the thing. So I kind of just like hold my threads back, and then once they're out of the way, let them go and stitch. And then I can back stitch, because back stitching, you stitch on top of your old stitches, and that's how you keep your stitching secure, right? You always clip your threads really close to the thing, otherwise you have all these nasty stray threads hanging out of something, and that also makes a product look really bad when there's lots of gross stitching hanging off, right? Alright, I'm going to do the other side. Alright, so I've got this, which is now folded over and stitched down 1/4 of an inch from each edge. So half of sewing is ironing. That's rule number 1. So after I sew some seams, any kind of stitching, I'm going to go iron it. This helps to set the stitch, and also just makes everything lie flat and nice. Look how crisp that is. Crisp. Yes, yes. Beautiful, right? Alright, so now we're going to do our next one. Our next fold over. At this point, if you want to do a mitered edge, you may. If not, you can just fold this over a second time. You just fold it over your second time, stitch down, fold it over a second time, stitch down. Alright, I'm going to teach you how I do a mitered edge. That's how we get this really nice corner. Yeah, so I'm going to show you how to do a mitered corner. And for that, we are going to use a point turner. If you don't have one, that's okay too. but this just shoves up into the corner to make it sit just nice and flat. So that's a thing that you can do. It's an option, it's available. If not, I've seen people use other objects to do this. You just don't want to use anything sharp enough to pierce through the fabric because that won't be great. Right. So we're going to get these nice corners. And again, you don't have to do a mitered edge if you don't want to. But we do the corners first and then we'll do the second seam. So I'll show you what I do. And that is, I actually fold it in half diagonally on the corner. And when you've done that, what you can do is you can grab your ruler and you start kind of right at that point that is going to be the next corner. It's just this first little bit right here. That's going to be the actual corner. And then I'm going to hold my ruler and I'm going to put this pin perpendicular to the fold right there. Right? So you see that, how that's perpendicular? And that's where I'm going to stitch. So I'm going to stitch this line and I'm going to back stitch top and bottom so that it's secured. Okay, let's do it. Okay. Alright, next I'm just going to iron this real fast. Alright, so I ironed that, and this is what I have. This is what it looks like right now, with the edges just touching. Boop. Beautiful. Right, so now I'm going to grab my fabric scissors, and I'm going to cut this off. And you'll want to test it before you cut, but I know this is good, so I'm going to go ahead and cut. And now I just have this. Now I've reduced the bulk and I can turn this inside out and grab my point turner if I want, and I have just a really great edge right here. Really awesome corner. And then I can iron it to make it look flat and sit exactly how I want it to do. But yeah, so that's how we do a mitered corner. And now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch the rest of this down at 1/4 inch. Okay? So you see I have my 4 corners. Boop, boop. Each of these corners is mitered, right? So after all of the corners are mitered, then I can just kind of pull this guy, fold it over that other 1/4 inch, stitch it down. Yeah? Because of the bulk that's right here at this corner, I'm going to put on my safety glasses just so that if the needle does break hitting that kind of bulk, I'm going to be protected. So I'm going to do that. So I'm here, and I'm actually going to bump my needle over maybe 2 spaces just so that I can stitch more along the edge rather than like in the middle so that this won't flap up. I've lined up this edge kind of with right here where the feed dogs are, that hole for the feed dogs. I'm lining it up right with that edge. Alright, when I get to a corner, what I can do is I can hand crank this down, or if I, stitch one stitch to that point. And then I can just lift it up so that my needle is down, and I can just lift it and spin it on that. So that's really awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Right to here. Hold that. dresser foot, spin it, align. Alright, so here we go. We got our little pocket. It's cute. It's finished. From this side, this is what it looks like. So that we have those nice edges are totally finished. Our serging is covered up. And then on this side, this is what this looks like. Nice finished little square. Well, it's a rectangle at this point, actually. Now, what am I going to do? Because after we sew, we always iron. So much crisper, right? So nice. So here we have it. Little pocket ready to go. Now we're going to do the same thing. And yeah, it's just a really beautiful mitered edges that we've got. Mitered corners, my goodness. These cute little mitered corners, they reduce the bulk. So that's really great. And they look pretty good. Look how cute they are. Cute little corners. So yeah, there you have it. Alright, so I have my pockets now. And what I'm going to do is if I wanted to do some pattern matching, I could, I would have planned that ahead of time in my cutting phase, but I didn't want to. So I could, and if I were to do that, I would do something like this and line it up, let's see, somewhere like that, right? And I would line it up and I would stitch it in that exact place. I cut these to be the same instead of just to preserve some fabric. And so that's not going to put this in a similar placement. So I'm not going to do that, right? So what I am going to do instead is I am going to turn my pockets. Whoop. I think I want them to face each other. I think that might be good. So then they can be kind of different. Or I could just have them be the same, kind of just being a contrasty thing. I think I like that more. So I'm going to do that. So just embrace that it's something different and it's going to go in opposite direction, right? So that's what we're going to do. And what I did is I folded this in half. So, whoops, let me show you. So here's the apron. And I found that kind of the halfway point was a pretty good starting point for my pockets. So I went ahead, folded it in half. And I've got this side. So I think the top of that is a really great place for my pockets to sit. All right, so then I think that about 3 inches from the edge, I kind of put my hands down, and that feels like a pretty good spacing to me of about 3 inches from this edge. So I'm going to align these. Nice. 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 Now I'm just going to pin these in place. All right, we are pinned, right? And if you want, you can try it on and see if that's sitting where you want it to sit, right? Let's stitch it on. All right, I am a lover of Berninas. Berninas are the best machines. And the number 5 foot is one of my most favoritist feet. This is the number 5. It's got this little kind of bar in the middle, and it's a great guide for all of the things. So we're going to use this. I love this foot. All right, so I'm going to stick this guy on. And if you had your needle in the middle, we didn't because we'd moved it over just a little bit, but if you have it in the middle, it can't stay there because it's going to hit the bar and then it's going to break. So it doesn't stay in the middle. You have to move it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put this under first. And we're gonna do a weird reinforcement stitching first, and then we'll get into using this. So what we're gonna do, because pockets are a point of high stress because you're sticking your hand in and out, and so these seams get a lot of wear and tear. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to create like a bit of a triangle here so that it can secure the edges a little bit more, so you're not going to rip it out every time you use your pocket or over time the usage of your pocket, right? So we're going to make like a little triangle, which means we're going to do a few stitches this way and then straight, and then we're going to go down. So I'm going to put this in kind of funny to do that. We're going to stick it in weird. This isn't the way you're supposed to stick in fabric, because you always want to be sewing so the bulk of your fabric is over here. So it's a lot to shove your whole project through this thing. So this is a little bit weird because we're going to do that for just a few stitches, and then we're going to go kind of back to normal. I am going to back stitch here. That's not proper technique. You're supposed to do just the 3 stitches and then like tie it off and stuff, but it's going to make it stronger, so it's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start off over here, and now that I've got I'm going to hold my threads so they don't go underneath. Now I better move my needle over, and I've decided, yeah, just moving it over 3 notches I think is going to be pretty good. So I'm going to do a back stitch real fast. And I'm going to stitch just diagonally. And I'm going to stop, and I'm going to pick up my presser foot, spin it on my needle, and then I'm going to do some straight stitching. And I actually want to bump this over just a little bit more. Perfect. Now I'm going to pick it up again, spin it, and I'm just going to get rid of that thread so it doesn't get caught later. And now I'm going to drop this again, and I'm going to stitch straight down. Again, when we get to corners, put down your needle, lift up your presser foot, spin your project, drop it again, stitch. Alright, yeah, so you see how I can align this edge that I'm sewing on right with the edge of this part of the foot, and then I've moved the needle over so then it's stitching parallel to that really nicely. And it just gives you a really beautiful, nice finish, and it makes it so that all of my stitching is going to be an equal distance from the edge because of this, because I line up that edge and I stitch, and it gives it a nice finish. After we stitch our pockets on, we iron, right? Iron, iron, iron. All right. So we can see that our stitches, these are our stitches from the second time we folded it over, and it's making this beautiful little parallel line with these, right? So this is using the number 5 foot, so you get everything a really nice equal distance from that edge, and it just makes it look really great, right? Very professional looking, very nice, right? Ouch, my hand. Alright, so then over here, we've got those stitches to make that triangle. So that's that reinforcement we were talking about, where it reinforces so that now when you pull on your pocket, there's a little bit less tension. There's stronger, it's not concentrated in one seam trying to rip it out, right? Instead, it's kind of spread into this triangle, and it's just a lot stronger. So there you go. Now go do the other one. Here's a pocket. Awesome. So now the pockets are on. So this is about the point you should be at. We've got our beautiful apron, and we are going to finish the edges. So what you're going to do is you're going to fold each edge over once and stitch it down. We're going to just fold it over 1/4 of an inch,
If you don't have serging, you can use your ruler, mark up 1/2 inch and then fold it to that 1/2 inch, and then that will be, a 1/4 inch. So you can fold it up 1/4 inch using your ruler. If you do have a serger, you can just fold across the serging and it'll pretty easily just bend naturally kind of right along the serging. Whoop. So we're going to do that once, and then we can make our edges be, our corners be mitered corners if you want to. If not, what you can do is you can just stitch them down, and then when we flip and flip, you can just stitch it down that way and just make sure that you don't have any pieces like hanging out, so then you have an overhang on the other side and it's not pretty, right? So as long as you cover it, right, and the outside looks really nice, whoop, so as long as you kind of keep that inside, that'll be fine. You can also, if we're going to do a fold and a fold, what you could do is when you get to here, you could just chop off this section and then kind of fold it in, and that'll reduce the bulk because this part will be kind of chopped off. You can also do the mitered corner. You got a few options. Pick your poison. It's totally fine. One thing though that we're not going to want to use a mitered corner on is our curve, right? So we've got this kind of armscye-esque curve, and we've got, the point that attaches to the bottom, and then this, which will attach to the neck. So you've got 2 points of those on either side, and because that goes into a curve, that doesn't have to be a mitered corner, because mitered corners are really used for creating like a 90-degree angle. And since, especially on this one, I for sure do not have a 90-degree angle when I fold this in, so I can just fold that and then fold it again, and then on that side, and then my second fold, bloop, bloop, and nothing's gonna stick out because it is curving inside anyway, right? So you can do that if you want to. It's a little bit easier because a mitered corner is not gonna work here, right? Alright, so let's go ahead and stitch down the first round where we just stitched everything down at 1/4 inch. Okay? So what I might do here, just to reduce some bulk, even though I'm going to do a mitered corner, I might just chop off this corner. Just chopping it off, and then I can fold this a little bit more easily, right? So I am sewing along a curve, right? And it's really not too different from sewing straight. So I don't know, it'll kind of try to like pull a little bit more because we've got some stretch here. So just pay a little bit of attention to that and just try to keep it flat. You'll be fine. Okay, so now all of my hems are folded over the 1/4 inch. So I've got that folded 1/4. And the outside, the right side of the fabric, it looks like this. Boop, boop. This is the top. And I've got this nice curve. Boop. Nice, nice, right? Alright, so now we're going to fold this over once more, but I think I want a mitered corner. I don't think I need them on the tops. I think they'll be fine. It's almost 90-degree angle, but it's a little bit wider, so I don't think I'm going to do a mitered corner there. But the 2 places I will want to do a mitered corner are at the very bottom, because that is pretty much 90-degree angle. So what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to fold this kind of this way in half, and kind of turn into a triangle. right sides together. Grab my ruler, line it up with that fold. And then take this pin and go straight down, right? And then I'm just going to stitch that, clip off my excess, right? Let's do it. Alright, so I've just stitched this one across, and I cut it down, but I think I'm going to cut just a tiny bit more, reduce just a little bit of bulk. So cut that down, and now go ahead and do this, and if you have a point turner, awesome, stick it in, help just poke your point out. Awesome, and now we have a nice beautiful 90-degree. Look at that. And then from this side, I haven't ironed it yet, so it's not going to look perfect, but it will when we iron, right? Nice. Pretty good. We'll iron it and it'll look just a little flatter, but there we go. Okay, now that we have our lovely corners all done, now we're just going to stitch down this second layer, right? So right now it's open, we've just folded it that one time, we've done the corners, and now we just need to fold it the other time on the 1/4 of an inch. Again, we used a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance so that we're turning it over a 1/4 of an inch and then another 1/4 of an inch, and then the turn of cloth is taking up the space here and here, which makes up an 1/8 of an inch, so it's a total of a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, right? Alright, let's sew it. Alright, so I folded one edge down, or two edges, and stitched them in place. We've got our beautiful corner. This is how it's looking. And then on the opposite side, we have just one row of stitching. It should be pretty equidistant from the edge. I haven't ironed it, so it does look a little bloopy, a little baggy. That's why we iron things. So of course I'm going to iron this next. There we have it. I'll show you this corner before I move forward. So I did kind of clip this corner down to reduce some bulk, so that now I'm going to fold it one more time, and this edge is just going to be a little bit less bulky. You can see how those are kind of laying flat against each other, making a nice corner. I probably clipped a little bit too much because we don't want this fraying, and sometimes that happens. But yeah, so this is that curved edge. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch this down once more. Alright, also if you want to and you're not just, using the serging to fold it over, you can iron it beforehand, and that will make it easier as you're stitching. So you can iron it beforehand if you want to. You can also iron it beforehand if you're not comfortable with just folding it and you have serging too. So that's an option. You can totally do that. Alright, so here's what I'm going to do. Show you how I've been doing this. I bumped my needle over 2 spaces so that I can get something a little closer to the edge, right? So that we have a little less of this poking out. Because if we do it right in the middle, then you can have too much of this seam here, and that can look a little funny. So I want more than half of this to be stitched down. So that's why I bumped my needle over, so that I can still put this through the middle, but it's just going to stitch a little closer to the edge, right? Give me a little bit more space, so I've got this edge a little bit more closely stitched too. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to line this up again with kind of the edge of where my feed dogs end, right here. Back stitch. Nice, nice. And yeah, I'm just going to keep this aligned with that edge as I stitch, and this is the curve, so I'm just it's gonna curve a little bit, but it's got enough room to stretch for that. You can see that and feel it It's got a little bit of stretch, but you don't want to stretch it too far. And I'm just folding like right at the edge of the serging, like right there, so it's like right up against it. If I fold like over here, you can feel that there's extra space in there. It's not as bulky, so you want to fold it right on that edge. Right. Again, I'm keeping this lined up, and since that's bumped over, it's going to stitch a little bit closer to the edge, right? Really nice. And I kind of just like press it down with my hands up to a point. You don't want to be more than like 6 inches away. You kind of want to just do those first like 4 or 5 inches and get it perfectly folded and push it in as it goes. And we have just this beautiful curved edge. Look at that. Nice and flat. Yes, yes. It'll sit flat. Right now it's kind of booping out. But again, that's why we iron stuff, because once we iron this, it'll sit totally flat. Let me show you. I'm going to iron it. 2 seconds of ironing. Sitting beautifully flat, right? There you go. Do that everywhere. Alright, here's one thing to note. Whenever you're clipping your threads, you should clip them as close to the fabric as possible. Even that is not quite satisfying to me because I don't want anything poking out, right? But yeah, you want your threads to be cut close. Alright, I'm going to take a second to talk about my law number 2, and that is consistency within the garment. So, there are so many sewing rules out there, and, you can pick and choose which ones you like. However, you have to use the same rules in the same garment. Okay? That's my rule. Of whatever rules you use, fine, use them, but be consistent within your garment, alright? So if you make a choice, you gotta keep it. So over here, I folded this one down first, and then I folded this second, right? So I had to do that on this side first. I actually did this side first, but... So I did this side, folding this side first, and then sewing this one second. That way both sides are consistent. Yeah, so both sides are consistent, right? So I want consistency within my garment, just because that's going to make everything look better and more symmetrical, right? So if I fold one side first on this one, then I should do that same thing, fold this side first on this side, and then do the top on this side, and then do the top on this side, right? Whatever order you do things, it's going to change kind of how your corners look. So try to be consistent, right? Consistency within your garment, right? Alright, so now we should be at this point where you've got your apron with your lovely pockets in, and all of your edges are beautifully hemmed, folded over twice, 1/4 inch each way, and 1/8 of an inch total of turn of cloth. So you used 5/8 of an inch seam allowance total, right? This is what the inside looks like. You can see it's really nice and beautifully finished from this side as well, which is what we want. Good craftsmanship, right? As well as this lovely outside with our beautiful mitered corners at the bottom, and our other corners just really beautifully folded over so that we don't see anything from the outside, right? Let's move on. Alright, so here's where we grab all of our rectangles, and these two are the same. Those are going to be our waist straps, our little ties, and then we've got our little neck strap. So we're actually going to do the exact same thing to all of these. So this, I'm just going to show you, let's just use the neck strap, and I'll show you how to put those together, right? I'm also doing a cartridge pleated skirt tutorial for this guy, And you can use these same steps to make the waistband. So that's great. Yeah, this goes for like pretty much any rectangular tie or external waistband like this one, not one where you'd use like a stitch and a ditch, and that's totally different techniques and things. So this one's a little bit weird, but anyway, any kind of rectangle thing, this will go for it pretty across the board. So this is something you're going to use a lot, hopefully. So let's get started. Alright, so I've got my neck strap, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick one side that's going to be my finished edge and one that's going to be my slightly less beautifully finished edge. So I'm just going to pick one. It doesn't really matter with the neck strap because, you know, they're both going to be on the neck, so it doesn't super matter. However, it does matter when I get to my my waist tie straps, because I want maybe one strap to, you know, like I want to be consistent within the garment, right? That's one of my laws of consistency within the garment. So with this one side is going to attach to the apron, right? So I want to be consistent with which side this one attaches. Like, I want to be consistent and make sure that if I have like my beautifully finished edge be the one that is on the garment, and this be my less finished edge, be the one hanging off, then I want to do the same thing on the other side, right? We just always want to be consistent within the garment. That just makes your craftsmanship so much better. It's going to be lovely. So for that, you want to pick, right? So pick for that one and be consistent with both of those. For the neck, it doesn't really matter, right? So let's just say this one will be my beautifully finished edge. So I've decided that. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold this exactly in half. Right? So I'm going to grab my pins. I'm going to pin one this way. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin this all the way down this way. Right? And I'm going to leave this edge unpinned. Alright, let's do it. Now, there are a few ways that you could do this. I'm going to show you this way. We're going to do this way. Know that there are other options if you want to make this seam less visible. So there are other ways of doing this, just so you know. Alright, so this is what we've got, right? This edge we're going to stitch along this edge, leave this one open, and then we're going to pull this out through that. And that is hard, I will tell you that. That's where a lot of people struggle and spend a lot of time doing that. That's where I get tears and people on the floor. But anyway, it's fine. You did great. Let's go sew this up. Okay, let's stitch this guy up. Alright, now remember, we have a different seam allowance on this. This is a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that's going to make it easier for us to turn it around later, so that'll be nice. On my machine, I got this little notch, this tiny little one, that's 1/4 of an inch, so that means this one is 3/8, this line that's just past the feed dogs, right? And then, of course, I got 1/2 inch and 5/8, right? The only one that's marked is 5/8 and actually 1/4 inch up here, too. So yeah, you can just do that, and they go by 1/8 of an inch. So if you don't know which one it is, start with the 1/4, move one over, there you go. Right? So what I'm going to do is line the edge up with that 3/8 of an inch, and I want the very top of this to definitely get stitched. So I can even back stitch over that and go off the fabric just for a second if I need to absolutely get it on. So if you need to go off, you can. Yeah, do what you need to. You don't usually want to sew like off a fabric. You want to stop at the edge, but if you need to, do it. Alright, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch for a little bit, and I'm going to grab my seam gauge and move it to 3/8 of an inch. And as you sew more, you'll kind of just know when to turn, but right now we know that this other seam is 3/8 of an inch. So what I can do is I can kind of hold this to the side, and be like, yep, I think I've made it to the 3/8 of an inch, and then drop my needle and flip it right on that 3/8. And yep, that lines up perfectly. That's exactly the right amount. I've got my 3/8 right there. And now I can stitch 3/8 of an inch down the rest of the way. Right? Keeping that lined up right with that 3/8 line. Oh, this is separating and I don't want it to, so I'm going to force it back. And then I'm going to go all the way to the edge and back stitch. Alright, let's chop off. Boop. Awesome, so this is what we got. We always clip our threads as close as you possibly can. We don't want to have all these nasty stray threads. When somebody hands me a project and it's just got like all of these threads hanging off, I'm like, wow, you are not getting 100%, I can tell you that. Alright, so what's our next step? We're just going to iron this real fast. Alright, here we are again, and I don't want to iron all of this because if I iron this side, it's going to make it harder for me later. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to iron my seam as much as possible, just ironing what I've stitched, right? And that helps set the stitch, and that's great. Now what you can do is you can kind of try to like bounce it and kind of press the seam open. That'll make things a little bit easier later. So I'm going to just go ahead and do that and kind of press the seam open. And I am getting a ridge here, but we're going to take care of that later, right? You could also stick something long and skinny into it to hold it, but this is so skinny that like, this is just the easier option, right? So I'm kind of just going to open this seam up. And then I'm going to do the same thing kind of over here if I can, just a little bit, just a tiny. It's not going to really want to press open, but we'll do a little bit now. Yep. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip my corners. So if we've turned this inside out now, we're going to have all of this bulk, and on the inside, it's going to be trying to like turn in on itself, and it's just going to make your corner really bulky, right? Because on the inside, it's not going to have anywhere to fold in. So we need to make space so that it can fold in on itself. So you're going to go right past. I am so close to that stitching, right? So close, but I don't want to go through it, right? Right up close to it. And now I'm going to just do an edge here. And I'm just kind of angling it out just a little bit more, right? And I'm going to do pretty much the same thing up here. Trying to not go through the stitch, but kind of past it. And then kind of angle it in a little bit more. And that's going to give me space in the future. Alright? So I've got those edges really clipped really cleanly. And this is going to be beautiful for future me. Now let's turn it inside out. Alright, so this is the part where everybody starts screaming and crying because I have to turn this tiny tube inside out on itself, right? And there are different tools to do this, to turn things inside out. I have used a few. I don't honestly think they work super well. Alright, here's my hack. This is a knitting needle. This is what, size 10? And I want to use this side because if you use this side, it can poke through the fabric, right? So I'm going to get just a little bit more of this turned through. And it's such a small thing. 1 inches are always kind of the worst. So if you wanted to make your neck a little bit bigger, your neck strap bigger, I do not blame you. Alright, so the flat edge, I can use more pressure to kind of push it in. So what I'm going to do is kind of slide this on top. And then I could just use it to kind of push through. bit by bit, and it does take time. So put on a show. I just watched, what was it called? I just watched the originals. I liked it very much. I didn't watch the final season because I felt like the fourth season stopped at a good point. But anyway, you can watch the originals, watch some vampire show, or when my show comes out, you could watch my vampire film. It'd be great. Anyway, so what you can do is you can just stick it onto this guy and kind of shimmy it. And sometimes you could just grab the top too and kind of like pull that excess, and that kind of helps. But this is a process. I have seen people, depending on the fabric, take like an hour to do something of this size. Like skilled professionals, because it is difficult. So I don't want to scare you. It's kind of hard. It can be hard. I get it, and I'm sorry. But it'll be pretty in the end. So like, that's the thing. Anyway, so here's my hack. Use it. If you want to. Just don't use anything pokey that's going to poke through the top, right? That'll be difficult. You'll be sad. Alright, so once you get to a certain point, what I can also do is kind of just grab my fingers and kind of pull through from this end. Whoop. And you can try multiple things and just, figure out what works for you. I don't want to put too much tension on my fabric because I don't want to rip it, so keep that in mind. Alright, but yeah, once I pull it out, then I've lost some of that tension, and I can kind of like stick my finger in and kind of grab it. Whoa. And pull. Slide it all up. Yay, we're at the end. Whoop. All right, now we're at the end. That took me like 10 minutes, so it shouldn't be too bad, but I don't know, beginners, it always takes like 2 or 3 times as long, so give yourself a bit of time and just be patient, it's okay. For these points, in a perfect world, I could use a point turner. But getting this thing of this thickness into this thing is not going to happen, right? Because this is slightly wider than this is. So this is where I'm again going to use my knitting needle. And I'm going to very lightly do this, right? I'm going to stick it into my corners and very gently kind of push them out. And because I clipped those corners before, I should get some really beautiful, nice points here. And again, I'm not pushing hard, I'm not using a lot of muscle. I'm just very gently doing this. Don't use a pencil for this. I've seen a lot of students try to do that and poke through. And then of course you get the pencil graphite all over your piece too. And yeah, so don't use pencil. Knitting needle is the way to go. Alright, so now we have this lovely little edge. And I'm going to iron that up. Yay, yay. It's cute. It's pretty straight. We're happy. Alright. So now we've got our little our seam here. And again, this is where craftsmanship I see fail a lot, where it just like, you'll fold it over some random place or blah, 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 This is where we could really take our time and make something really beautiful though. Because what you want to do is kind of pull your edges so that let's say, okay, let me think about how I want this to be on my garment. I want this side or this side? What direction do I want this to go? I think this will be nice. So I think I want it to end of day sit kind of like this. So I want the seam closest to the body, and then this outside edge can just be outside, and that'll be a little bit nicer, right? So the inside edge is the seam. So because I've determined that, I guess this is going to be kind of my top edge. So this is facing me. This is going to go onto my garment like this. I'm going to pull this guy in. This is going to go onto my garment like this. then I want to hide this seam edge. If I have something gross like this, if I ironed it like that, then I'd have like this whole edge like sticking out being ugly. Yuck. No, 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 no. So we want to turn it so that we don't see that edge at all. But we also want it to be just a tiny, tiny amount from this other side. And that is a bit hard, but it's going to be beautiful when it's done. So I don't want like a large gap like that. That is still like a lot. I want it to be just very tiny, just the tiniest, tiniest bit that this goes over, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to iron it from the opposite side of what I want. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get real close to it. And it should be like, it's like you're trying to do it like right on that very edge of the seam, but it just goes a little bit past that pulls it under, right? Like it's just, you're going a little bit past that seam, enough to pull it under and not do much else, right? And my seam is actually looking like pretty baggy as it is. So the first thing I'm going to do, since, you know, this is all looking pretty sad after getting pulled out, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to have the seam open, and I'm going to try to press this with the seam open. I can kind of feel and get that done as much as I can. And I can use my knitting needle once again. Look at these unconventional tools we're using to kind of help flatten it from the inside if I need to. That's feeling pretty good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to kind of iron this kind of nice and flat from this side. Right, so it's kind of like right in the middle in a weird place. It's not going to stay that way. I'm just doing that for now, right? All right, so since I did that, now back to here. From the outside, I want to push it just a tiny, tiny bit and iron it that way. So it's basically like flat on the seam, but just a tiny bit goes over. And I think this isn't flat enough for me to do that, so I'm going to iron it just a little bit more. And then I'm going to try again. Okay. Awesome. Alright, so I've ironed this, and it's just a tiny, tiny bit, right? It's not a lot. Even this is like more than I would usually want, but because there's some interfacing in there, it's just a little bit thicker. But you can see how it's like basically on the edge, right? So I've got just that edge, and then it just goes over just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit extra, so that from this side there's just a little bit of the other seam shown through. And then from the outside, there is nothing. I'm not going to see the underside tucking through, so all I see is the beautiful, nice edge, right? So it will take a time, and that's okay. Again, take your time, make things really nice, build up your skills for later. But also, it's okay to make mistakes, you know? Happy little accidents, it's fine. You learn through making lots of mistakes, and even as a professional, you will just make lots of mistakes because this is the world we live in. That's just, such is life, you know? And like, that's fine. That's why we have seam rippers. It's alright. Alright, let me show you real fast. Something I see a lot from beginners is in this place, they'll actually just like leave extra space down in that seam. And so then the fold will be like this. And so, yeah, the seam is hidden, but it's hidden, you know, you're not going right to the edge, and it's like deeper in there. And it won't be this exaggerated with like 1/4 of an inch, but it'll be like a little bit less. But really it should be just one side is pulling a little bit more than the other, right? Not both of them like that. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. I'm just going to go over the whole thing now, again, so I can get both edges totally flattened out and really nice. Alright, so let's take a close-up look at this. Again, this is the outside. This is what's actually going to be facing the outside of the garment. And you see that I don't see the seam at all. There's no seam, right? I don't see the seam, and I also don't see anything coming out underneath. When I flip it, this is the seam. It's like right there, but it's slightly pulled in, right? So I can see just a tiny bit of the underlayer of the top side sticking through, right? So I see that from this side, just that little bit. I don't want to see that on the outside, so if I were to use this side as the outside, I would see that and it wouldn't be as pretty. So this is the outside, nice, beautifully finished, right? Okay, so yeah, we've got it just tucked in that little bit, that tiny, tiny amount of fold right there that's facing me, right? It's going to be on the inside of the garment. Just that tiny, tiny bit with the seam. Right? Right. So, there you go. Do that 2 more times with the waist straps. And then we'll attach these. Alright, just real quick. Got your waist ties. Just remember, you're also doing a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with these guys, and we just do the same thing that we did with the neck, and turning it inside out is going to be a little bit easier because we have 1.5 inch, so that part will be easier. But yeah, so do it with these now. Yay! Alright, so here we've got one of the waist ties, and these are 1.5 inch finished. And you can see it's a lot easier to turn this inside out. Like I can do a lot of this even just with my own hands. So you should have a lot easier time doing this. And if you're worried about doing the neck, you can absolutely just make your necktie a little bit thicker, make it a 1.5 inch, and it'll be a lot easier to turn inside out. So if you're worried about it, it's okay. Just go with the larger measurement then. You can see, so this is the larger one. If I stick in my knitting needle, and kind of do some hand stuff, I can actually get pretty far pretty quickly with this. So again, use this if you think you're gonna struggle. Just go make it thicker. Alright, so now we've got all of the straps to this point. So we still have this unfinished edge here that we want to get rid of. We don't want to leave it like that, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to tuck it in that 1/8 of an inch. And actually, because we've got some excess here in the seam allowance, you can take your scissors and chop that off. So I'm going to try to catch just that extra, just the seam allowance, and kind of do what I've done for the other stuff and kind of clip it diagonally. And that'll just reduce a little bit of bulk and make this a little bit easier. So now what I can do is just kind of shove it into itself. And it should be about 3/8 of an inch. If it's a little off, that's totally fine. But then kind of try to shove it in as much as possible to about that amount. And then you're going to kind of flatten it out, make it all nice and straight. Because I've got a stripe here, I think I'm going to just try to follow it. Alright. So I try to keep these like matched up as much as possible too. And then what I'm going to do is just do a straight stitch down here. And I'm going to back stitch top and bottom, right? So that's going to kind of finish this edge nicely. So do that for all of these. We'll do that to these ends of the straps. And then we'll move on. And I'm going to try to stitch this pretty close to the edge. The edge of the fabric this way. So what I end up with is just kind of a straight stitch down here. And this is a little bloopy here, but you know, it always comes out. I feel like this always comes out a little funky. But yeah, so here you go. So you just kind of stitched it down. And so we got a nice edge here that's finished. And of course we could kind of pull this a little bit, but not too much because we went right at that edge as much as possible, right? So it is a finished edge. It's not as beautiful as an edge like this that's been stitched, you know, here. But we wouldn't be able to, you know, flip this inside out as easily if we didn't do this. So there you go. Okay, all of our straps are totally finished now. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna attach them to our apron, and that'll be our last steps. Yay! What we're gonna do is we're gonna make little boxes on them. So you can choose whether you make these go on the outside or on the inside, like this or like this. That's your choice. It's a design aesthetic, so pick your poison. That's totally up to you. Let me think. You could also do some really fun stuff here. You could put like little buttons here or have them, you know, like you can also make it adjustable. So I could stitch this side on and then have this side. I could have little buttonholes and then a button here, and then it could be adjustable for different sizes, right? So that's a really fun thing that you can totally do if you want to. You can add a little decorative elements of any sort that you want. So have some fun. So think about it and do whatever you want. I think, I think I want these on the inside. So I think that's what I'm going to do. And, you know, also if you want, if you look at this and you're like, you know what, I feel like I'm getting more of this seam than I want. If it's this way, you can swap it and have the seam be on the outside. So yeah, do whatever you feel you want to do. Your choice, you know, look at it and say, what looks good? I think I am going to do that because now that I'm looking at it, I'm seeing that I'm going to see more of this seam than I would of this one. And this is pretty much the same either way, so I'm just going to swap it. And yeah, I think I'm going to stick it underneath. And what you'll do is just make sure that it's the same. So if this lays flat, whoop, this is flat, it's going to connect here, right? Just make sure that you're not twisting this up before you attach it, right? So it should be kind of flat and then it goes into this end, right? Bloop, bloop. Now, I believe that I added about 1 inch on the neck strap for this section, but I'm going to consult my notes and then mark that. Yep, I consulted my notes and it's 1 inch down. So what I'm going to do, now this is totally finished. Now I can just line this up with the top edge and mark 1 inch down. And now I've switched to I'm using my blue pencil, since that is the more appropriate color at this point. So I've marked myself a little box for that, little 1 inch. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Make myself a little 1 inch box. Boop. There we go. And now I'm going to grab this. And this is the edge I'm going to see the most. So that's going to be my outside edge. And then I just want to make sure that like the edge that I folded over is going to be not visible. So I wouldn't want to flip this way and have that edge, that kind of just that little tiny bit that's visible from this side, and I don't want that. So I want to make sure I'm doing this right. Boop, boop. But then I wanted this side sticking out. Oof. All right. Now I'm going to match this up and pin it in place. And I'm going to scoot it over just a tiny bit from this edge, not too much, but just like maybe a 1/16 of an inch from that edge. And that just gives me just a little bit of space. That way, again, I'm not going to see this poking out from this side, right, when it's finished. So I want it on the edge, pretty close, but a tiny bit over because I don't want to see it from that side. So it's just like a tiny, tiny bit. not much. All right, pin this one. Again, kind of pull this straight. Let's get this one. Again, pin it just like a tiny bit over from that edge so we don't see it peeking out. And then if you wanted at this stage, since it's pinned, you could try it on and see if it fits and see how it's looking to you. Let's go ahead and try it on. Boop. And let's sew. Alright, so I really want this to be strong, and I want that strength to also be a little bit decorative. So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch a box around, and then we're going to have X's. And that just makes sure that it's stitched all, in every place, top, bottom, so we don't have a flap coming out. The sides are all stitched. So the square makes everything stitched in place. And then the X just adds a little extra decoration and also just a little extra strength since this is a point of high stress, right? So let's do it. I want to keep an equal distance from not necessarily this. This edge should be pretty well lined up with this, but if it's not perfectly, like it's, maybe just a little funny, a little off here and there, we don't want to tell from the outside, right? Because the outside is what we're going to see. So I want to measure everything from the outside of the garment, and if you wanted, you could stitch from this side. It's a little harder to see everything though, so we'll stitch from the underside. But every distance I want to measure from this if I can, and from this one, just so that the outside looks phenomenal. Alright, here we go. And I'm wanting to stitch pretty close to this edge here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try to line myself up with, again, like the edge of the feed dogs right here. So I'm going to try to start there, which is a little less than 1/4 of an inch. It's about 1/8 of an inch. So there we go. Let's start. I'm going to go just a little further up. Next stitch. Again, we lift up our presser foot, we spin. I'm going to try to that's nice. Might be a little less. Lift up presser foot, spin, drop. Right. And then we'll just stitch against the very bottom of this. Boop, boop. Now I want to go right to that corner if I can. And here I'm going to spin and go diagonally, right? So I'm going to try to line this up pretty well. And if I want, I can grab this guy to kind of help it line up precisely. And I think that's looking pretty good. Stitch there. And if you want to reinforce anything, I would reinforce the top. So then what I can do is go ahead and just do this other stitch right on top of the other one. On top. It's going to strengthen that area because that's a high area of stress, right? And then drop this again. Again, if I wanted, I could kind of line that up, make sure it's going to... I don't know if this is the best tool for that, actually. Here, there we go. Pretty good. And let's backstitch. And there we go. So this is what we wind up with, right? We've got this cute little box with this little X through it. And yeah, so this is pretty close to the top, so I don't have like a lot of gaping here. So you want that to be pretty close, but I also wanted to give myself a little bit more room on these edges. That's why I did kind of 1/8 of an inch there, and then a little bit less room top and bottom, again, so we don't have anything, poking out too much. So There you go. Here's what it looks like on this side. Now let's do the other one. And I want just a little bit over for this guy. Nice back stitch. Lift it, lift the presser foot, turn it. Boop, boop. Make sure everything's lining up nicely. Once again, drop my needle, twist. I'm going to clip these while I'm here so they don't get in my way later. Alright, I'm going to try to keep that lined up. And then I want to stitch pretty close to the very top edge. I want to spin. Right. Should be a box. It's getting a little stuck. There's a lot of layers there, so it's getting a little chunky. There we go. Okay, so that you should be at this point now where we've got the neck strap in place, pockets, finished edge, right? We don't have our waist straps yet, our little ties, so we're going to add those and that'll be the last step. Okay, neck strap is done. We're just going to do the same thing with these little boxes with our waist straps, our ties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the not so pretty edge on the inside once again. There I have a pretty edge and a not so pretty edge. And for this one, we want to just have our not pretty edge in here because you should have one pretty edge and that should be the one that is hanging out, right? So the one that's nicely done, not the one that has the stitch across it, right? We're going to hide that now. So I also want the seam to face down, right? Because you see things on top. Typically. So you see the things on top, you're not going to see the bottom, right? So if I put the bottom on top, then I'm much more likely to see the seam, and that's not going to be as pretty, right? So I want the top to be the nice folded edge, right? Alright, so this one goes here. Again, not so pretty seam. And then facing me this way is where I can see that seam that's turned under, right? So the turned under seam is on the bottom facing me right now, which is the wrong side, right? Now I'm going to move this over 1.5 inches from this edge, and that's where this is gonna be. Gonna grab my pencil again using blue. Boop. And I'm going to try to just align it with this edge and then go straight from there. So I want something like that where it just matches up just barely at this corner. But I don't want it like this, right? I don't want it to follow that line because then my waistband's going to go down like that, right? I want it to be straight. So that's why I should align with this line perfectly. It should be parallel to that and then just touch this corner. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pin this in place and do the same thing on the other side. Alright, for this one, let's just keep everything a nice even 1/8 of an inch away from all the things. Boop, boop. So I'm gonna use right here, this part of the foot is kind of gonna be my guide. It should be about 1/8 of an inch between here and here. I'm gonna go there and trying to line up all my edges 1/8 of an inch right here, and I think that's pretty close to that. So you should really hold your threads for the first few stitches. I'm going to back stitch. And then before I get 1/8 of an inch from the edge, put down my needle, spin, drop again, and that's perfect. That's exactly how this should line up with this part of the foot right along the edge of where I'm stitching. Perfect, perfect. All right, let's go. All right, here. Press foot up, spin around the needle, spin around the needle. Pocket full of posies, I don't know. Now we have this beautiful little X box. Right? Now do that again. And finally, we're done! So now you've got your cute little apron with the little neck strap and your little waist ties. Look! You can tie it in place. Doop doop. Ta-da! And your little pockets. Now you're ready to go. Super stylish, pretty fun. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you had some fun. I did most of the time. Yeah, give it a try and send me pictures. I want to see how it turns out. So I hope you give it a try, or if not, I hope you just learned something.